Chapter 241. Industrial Monastic Order 2. The small flint from Qin Issei's disposable lighter refill was a ferrocerium alloy. It was overwhelmingly superior in performance, durability, and longevity compared to natural flints. It was incomparable to expensive flints that needed to be replaced after firing 10 or 20 shots. Could even create sparks when slightly wet with rain. Whether wet gunpowder would ignite was a different matter, but so far no one knew about this. They were just happy that the loading speed had doubled compared to existing muskets. The overwhelming difference would only become clear decades later when the flintlock method was widely adopted in Europe as well. For now, the knights and apprentices were just amazed. These were simultaneously supplied to hundreds of Knight Order members. When did they make them so quickly? There's been a lot of noise about building factories lately. Is this the result? Silence. As the apprentices chattered like this, Knight Commander Oytoten calmed them down and delivered another piece of news that would excite them. We plan to double the number of knights by next year, so those who wish to participate in the knighthood examination should apply from next month. Double. This time, the entire Knight Order became noisy at the news. They couldn't understand now. They were ignorant, as in the case of the flints. How? Wasn't the limit about 2 knights per tractor? If so many knights are recruited, how will they be managed? It's not like tractors can be dug out of the ground, and they can't be produced in such large numbers. It's impossible, isn't it? Of course it was possible. Tractors were the core technology driving the community's economy. Thanks to tractors, an abundance of crops were produced, enough for all members to eat and have leftovers, allowing everyone to live prosperously by exporting massive amounts of crops to the British Isles. However, its limitations were also clear. Since tractor production was absolutely dependent on resources coming from Qin Issei's mansion. The various steel pipes that make up the steam engine in tractors, they use pipes directly from Qin Issei's house, bending and attaching them as needed. Similarly, for various parts, the same applies. At most, only the boiler room, which requires less technical skill and can be made with cast iron, is made in the ironworks on Roanoke Island. Since the amount of steel coming from Qin Issei's house is ultimately limited, the production of tractors will eventually reach a limit. And if the population increases exponentially while the number of tractors only increases arithmetically, the land distribution of 25 hectares per person and the modern agriculture that has maximized labor efficiency would all become impossible. In other words, Virginia community's agriculture would collapse. And before the industrial age arrives, the collapse of agriculture means the collapse of the system. Therefore, the community had to choose one of 2 options. Should they let the current system collapse? Or innovate tractor production? Here, this structure of an iron furnace is called a reverberatory furnace. Obviously, Qin Issei had to choose the latter, especially now that tractors were also going to be used in war. 21st century educational comics became suspiciously detailed to satisfy parents' demands along with market saturation, and thanks to that, Qin Issei could roughly understand what technologies increased steel production during the Industrial Revolution. And that rough understanding was enough. Isn't this what we use to melt bronze? What? You already have it. Those technologies didn't just pop out of thin air either. After months of trial and error, and following the Angel's future knowledge to reconstruct the reverberatory furnace and crucible methods from over 100 years in the future, steel production dramatically increased. Now it was time to innovate the tractor manufacturing process with that steel. Following firearms production, now iron and steel making. Having achieved some success with his rudimentary future knowledge, Qin Issei began to gain confidence and become a bit arrogant. Yeah, why couldn't I do it? If Oytoten can play these isekai games, so can I. So he immediately stormed into the tractor manufacturing factory managed by the Knight Order and said, "Oh, don't you know? This is the wealth of nations. Is this not yet in this world? This is division of labor. Ah, you mean we should systematize the process? That's right. And standardize the parts too. Yes. Understood. Let's do that." At the responses of the Knight Order technicians, who answered as if it was all too obvious. Qin Issei asked with a deflated feeling. Do you know about division of labor? What? It instantly became embarrassing. It felt like leaving a comment after watching a knowledge YouTube video thinking you've mastered the world, only to be refuted by an expert. Upon reflection, Qin Issei realized that the wealth of nations originated in England, and all the ironworkers here were English. Moreover, this was the early modern period. The Netherlands, in the midst of its war of independence, was enjoying success with the division of labor and standardization in shipbuilding processes, churning out massive productivity, and come to think of it, this was also an era when joint stock companies existed. It was already the early days of capitalism. Then, why haven't you been doing it this way until now if you knew? When Qin Issei, feeling awkward, asked, the craftsman answered in confusion. Well, you kept producing improved versions. Haven't the parts and structure been constantly changing? True. Due to the many trial and error experiences in the early days of tractor introduction, they kept making various modifications which became a habit, frequently changing models. As a result, tractor parts weren't compatible with each other, and their production necessarily involved craftsmen intervening individually. It was Qin Issei's fault. After Qin Issei, who had failed to become an Isekai hero with future knowledge, quietly retreated, the instructed craftsmen began to improve the tractor production process. After many trials and errors and improvements over the past few years, the overall structure of the tractor had somewhat stabilized. It wasn't bad to introduce division of labor and standardization. In the midst of the production process's efficiency improvements, Qin Issei's amateurish suggestions like introducing something called a conveyor belt might be good began to shine a bit. In an instant, the scale of tractor production itself was inflated. Tractors that previously came out at a rate of about one every month or two suddenly came out several at a time, leaving the craftsmen dumbfounded by their own accomplishment and urgently seeking people. They needed a tremendous number of hands to keep this production belt running. And only then did the craftsman and Qin Issei's hair stand on end. Now, when it's hard to find people. Moreover, introducing division of labor makes work terribly boring and tedious. This was one of the major reasons why division of labor was only limitedly introduced until the capitalist system, resistance from the field. They soon panicked, wondering if they had built a new factory and suffered for nothing, and spent several nights devising all sorts of strategies for recruitment. And the day after posting the job advertisement, the factory was full. Why? Why are they rushing to work when they could just loaf around? People worked silently for reasons unknown even to those who employed them. Qin Issei pondered. Is it because the pay is high? It wasn't. Or perhaps, with war approaching, they're volunteering out of patriotism, like enlisting in the army. That was partly true, but not the main reason. By the way, why are all the people who came here wearing the same clothes? The color is almost gray? And isn't that fabric for tents? There lay the answer. The reason they participate in this monotonous, tedious, boring labor that treats people like machines. This is indeed suitable for meditation. Let's invite other brothers and sisters to the factory as well. Sure. Now is the time for labor, so let's remain silent. Let our hands move for the community, and our souls move for the Lord. For the holy community. It was because of its monotony. Labor that's simple like 108 prostrations, good for training, not only receives compensation but gives something back. As the community became materially prosperous, conversely, people seeking spiritual elevation emerged. Those who wished to live frugally and modestly, adhering to strict moral codes. Regardless of gender, they wore simple, undyed clothes. Their buttons were made of wood instead of ivory or gems commonly used by others. Their sleeves didn't have the lace that was currently fashionable in the community, and the fabric was the kind used for making tents. They lived together around the factory in communal living, creating their own rules, tightening parts, cleaning, oiling, and meditating, under the belief that labor would make their souls healthy. They were Virginia's first industrial monastic order. Chapter 242. Labor 1. Weapons capable of changing the tide of war. have been secured, and soldiers to handle those weapons have been created. Military provisions are available, and various other logistics supplies are being prepared. Now a means to transport them is needed. Obviously, if we're not planning to build roads through hundreds of kilometers of wilderness from here to Florida, there's only one option. We need ships. I thought about reaching out to England, but then I realized they're also in a tight spot, requisitioning ships to use as warships at the slightest provocation. So we have to procure ships ourselves. Clippers are difficult. Clippers are transport ships that sacrifice everything else for speed, making them difficult to use right away. Besides, being large ships from several centuries in the future, they take a long time to build. Since the goal is to move a not-so-distant distance, what we need now isn't speed but stability and ample loading capacity. With the simplest structure possible. To float as many as possible on water. We needed lots of cargo ships rather than warships. As our shipyard has been operating for quite some time, systems have been established, and skilled workers have increased accordingly. Thanks to this, we could design an independent structure suited to our needs, different from ships popular in contemporary Netherlands or around the world. First, we widen the deck as much as possible. This is the opposite of the Netherlands and other places where decks were narrowed for purposes such as tax avoidance. Naturally, given the cargo we need to load, this was an inevitable result. Since we now have to put a huge piece of metal on the ship, stability is paramount. We widen the deck and maximize the distance between masts. And in between, we secure one tractor. Of course, considering our tractors weigh dozens of tons, we can't just place them on the deck. We design the deck to open and insert them inside. A new ship focused on transporting tractors and various logistical supplies, abandoning speed and compatibility in favor of safely handling massive cargo volumes. In reality, that alone wasn't enough to transport tractors. So we borrowed the help of French merchants. More precisely, we borrowed their ships. It's a situation where a massive volume of essential goods will be needed anyway. In our community, we have furs but no cotton cloth. We have various treasures but lack essential metals like copper. Accordingly, numerous French-flagged ships crossed the Atlantic into our territory, and we borrowed their ships while they stayed at the market. And on each of those ships, we loaded tractors disassembled into parts. Then, we transported those tractors to various parts of Florida, along with people and equipment to reassemble and maintain the tractors. That solved the biggest problem now. We just need to gather the remaining logistics supplies to load onto those ships. You said everything has been gathered? Yes. We proceeded by purchasing from various factories established recently. Most items were quickly filled. Strange. Weren't all the people in our community reluctant to work? These supplies weren't imported, so where are they accumulating from? From where? Why? Equals. Even with ships, just hammering iron nails into wood to make a hull doesn't complete everything. This merely forms the skeletal structure, the foundation upon which a functioning vessel must be built. The hull alone is merely a floating container, incapable of purposeful movement across vast waters. Ships need sails to catch wind and move. Without these carefully crafted canvas sheets, strategically positioned to harness the power of the wind, ships cannot move beyond the mercy of currents and tides. These sails require precise engineering and placement to transform natural forces into directed motion. Similarly, ropes are needed to secure and control those sails. No, ropes are necessary everywhere to control the ship's elements and keep them from shaking. These complex networks of cordage form the sinews of the vessel, connecting masts to sails, hull to rigging, and providing the sailors with the means to adjust and adapt to changing conditions at sea. Without this intricate web of ropes, the ship becomes an uncontrollable mass of wood and canvas. Only when various implements are in place, from navigation tools to proper sleeping quarters, from food storage to freshwater barrels, can a ship function as a ship and fulfill the role King Issei and Virginians desire. Transporting logistics supplies to Virginia. A ship is not merely its visible parts but rather a carefully orchestrated system of components working in harmony. It's the same. For an army to function as an army, weapons and soldiers alone are not enough. Simply thinking about it, Even if just hundreds of people gather to live together, various supplies are needed. They need uniforms to wear, tents to use when staying outdoors. If there are swords, belts are needed to carry them, and oil to maintain the blades. These make up the majority of the logistics supplies Kin Issei mentioned. Since these things aren't available in Virginia now, let alone Florida, these items must be produced as efficiently as possible to meet hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of needs. They were completely different in nature from the luxurious handicrafts primarily made in Virginia before. That's why Kin Issei was all the more confused. People in the Virginia community already enjoy wealth that satisfies basic needs with plenty to spare. Moreover, no labor is required to enjoy such wealth. The reality is that everyone in the community enjoys a lifestyle that would be typical for nobles of other countries. In such a situation, labor belongs not to the realm of survival but to hobbies. With most labor power tied up in this way, the community's productivity couldn't be good. Yet logistics supplies were easily prepared. Enough to handle not just what would be used in Virginia but also the quantities needed in Florida. To understand this curious situation, we need to delve deeper. Virginia's first industrial monastic order emerged next to a tractor farm. They deliberately wore rough clothes, ate frugal meals, and enjoyed a difficult lifestyle. As with the early church in ancient Rome and medieval monastic orders, those living such lives gradually became objects of curiosity. And those who offer their wealth, time, and passion for something of greater value are always bound to become objects of respect. Chapter 243. Labor. 2. Why do you do such work? Doesn't the community need my hands? Especially if that greater value is a socially encouraged value. Now it's the early 17th century, still an era dominated by religion. Whether Europeans who have lived their entire lives in the Christian world or Americans who have been accepting Christianity for over 10 years now, the image of dedicating oneself to Christian values and the community naturally appeared quite positive. In other words, their actions looked sufficiently honorable. And that was what the people of this community so desperately craved. For Americans, it's familiar for the wealthy to deliberately bestow benefits around them to gain power and prestige. And particularly the Europeans in this land are those who came with aspirations to become high persons, like the gentlemen of their home countries. When such people were given wealth, what remained was obvious. My name is Jeffrey Cage. I now wish to dedicate everything to the Lord and this community, and I heard this monastic order performs work suitable for that purpose. Could I possibly join? A wave of countless membership applications spread. In an instant, the number of members in the so-called tractor monastic order rapidly increased to 3 digits, and the factory had to scramble to create jobs for the monks who were flooding in. However, no matter how many tractors were needed, they weren't needed infinitely. Soon the tractor monastic order restricted membership, and the countless applicants who had gathered lost their way. In response to such demand, similar derivative monastic orders were formed in several fields, only to fizzle out repeatedly. The reason these monastic orders disappeared was clear. Because there was no honor. Everyone wanted to do proper work, not gather among themselves to do woodworking, gardening, or embroidery that wasn't of much help. Of course. Wait a minute. What's wrong, dear? No, labor is flocking to the monastic order? Then we too. Those earning money in shopping complexes and elsewhere didn't just stand by and watch. Irish carpenter Taryn had his long-awaited dream of business expansion grounded for several years. He seemed to have finally found a way forward. Dear, do knights have separate scarves? No, there was no such thing. Then they'll need them now. Want to try it? What Taryn had in mind was nothing special. In this era, there was no systematic uniform, so it was common to wear scarves of specific colors for identifying friend from foe. He just thought that knights would soon go to war, so they would need scarves of specific colors. But how things actually unfolded was a bit different. The government decided, following his suggestion, to now dress knights in certain shoes, coats, vests, pants, etc., according to their rank. It was a jackpot. Taryn immediately gathered friendly shoemakers and built a shoe factory. And then, he waited for a shoe monastic order to open and people to gather to work. And soon they swarmed in. Taran happily employed them and set them to work. Soon everything would be good. Didn't about 50 people gather recently? Why are there only 10? The factory was empty. When he asked a nearby shoemaker in confusion, the answer was a masterpiece. About 2/3 haven't shown up since the third day, saying they don't seem to have manual dexterity. What about the remaining third? They said the work was too fun for meditation. Only then did Taran realize the problem. The reason was so obvious yet so absurd. They didn't come to be employed for compensation or rewards. They came for labor itself. Taran's mistake was providing complex and interesting work to such people. Labor had to be simple, so that even people without manual dexterity could work, so that everyone could participate in the monastic activity. Labor had to be monotonous to that extent, so that one could meditate sufficiently while working, so that tedious tasks would continue like a water wheel, turning and turning. Monastic orders formed everywhere eagerly broke down work processes again and again. In the process, if difficult tasks remained, they tried employing simple machines. The work of cutting saws, treating leather, sewing, and polishing was all separated from Taran's shoe factory. Similarly, nail factories, scarf factories, and pin factories established throughout the community became like that. Places that provided labor and experiences in the most simple and standardized ways possible, so that even those without manual dexterity could participate, so that as many people as possible could participate. Like, if Adam Smith, who would be born about 100 years later, had seen it, he might have thought, is this right? But anyway, that's how it rolled. As a result of nearly 10,000 monks working diligently like that, aren't there too many logistics supplies? I wonder how many pairs of leather boots alone. We'll send the excess items to Florida. Naturally, overproduction occurred. In a society of only 100,000 people, how much could possibly be needed? And fortunately, thousands and tens of thousands of people in the South needed their help. Various supplies were neatly loaded onto the community's newly built ships. Shoes, pins, underwear, scarves, wooden nails, hats, and so on. Now that preparations to depart were complete, all that remained was to launch the ships to finalize war preparations. And the Virginia Community Government's Council of Six, or the Six for short, loaded one more item onto that ship. That item was a miraculous totem that would greatly boost the morale of soldiers while preemptively blocking any dissatisfaction that might arise during military life in a foreign land. At the same time, if captured by the enemy, it could be a seed of destruction that would instantly turn the community into chaos and destroy it without a single foundation stone remaining. That item was the angel. From the beginning, if the community lost this war, it was over. From the Spanish perspective, Virginia had overturned a colony. From the moment Florida was overturned and the community decided to support it, the community became a greater threat to Spain than England. Isn't Spain's money line in the New World? Therefore, Spain wouldn't leave Virginia alone. This was a war that had to be won. And in a war that had to be won, he needed to be there. So he, the nameless angel Kin Issei, departed to San Agustin, Florida. This was around early February 1611. Chapter 244, True Knights 1. San Jose, a colonial stronghold located at the western edge of Florida. It wasn't a particularly large city, nor was it an especially important one. It was just one of many strongholds hastily built in Florida to check the Virginia community and England, a rather ordinary place that in the original history would have been established about 100 years later. The fate of this small village, where about 200 to 300 people lived, changed during the recent slave rebellion. It was around the time when news of San Agustin's fall spread, the rebellion intensified, and the strongholds that Spaniards had built throughout Florida began to collapse. Spanish people from northwestern Florida fled here in large numbers amid the madness of the rebellion. No, it wasn't limited to the Northwest. Like a rolling snowball, more and more slave owners fled from various parts of Florida to places where other slave owners had already fled. As a result of thousands of colonists flooding in, this place became one of the largest settlements in the Viceroyalty of Nueva España. Of course, in reality, it was merely a gathering place for fleeing slave owners. Look, San Jose is visible. Prepare to land. But even such a refugee gathering place was a very precious stronghold for the current Spanish army. The last city of Spain's Florida colony to maintain loyalty, and a good place to use as a rear base when reconquering Florida in the future. It was no coincidence that about 2,000 Spanish troops arrived at this place to suppress the slave rebellion. Over the past decade, roads meticulously built in the Spanish colony spread densely around San Agustin. Using this place as a bridgehead, recapturing nearby Indians, and then sweeping away nearby settlements would begin the full-scale suppression of the rebellion. The force of 1,500 troops that arrived here now was sufficient to sweep through Florida. Commander Gasper looked around, enjoying the feeling of land under his feet after a long time with satisfaction. Welcoming crowds were looking up at him with desperate eyes. They seemed to already know what orders he had received from Nueva España. In fact, that was the only reason for him to come here. Gasper cleared his throat and shouted to the citizens of San Jose. What has been lost or gained through treason will eventually return to its original owner. Then, amidst endless cheers, people stamped their feet and stretched out their arms. They were people who knew very well about things lost or gained through treason. They had lost their farms, slaves, luxury goods, and mansions after the rebellion. Slaves had gained freedom, and those things had to return to their original owners. After landing, Gasper received voluntary support of food and various supplies and immediately headed east. The target was San Marcos, the nearest sizable city. If they captured that place, they could reach various colonies within the Florida peninsula in one breath through the connecting roads. They reclaimed and planted flags in several abandoned villages along the way, believing they would soon be rebuilt. And they finally headed toward San Marcos without obstruction. Wait! Something visible ahead. What? In an era without telescopes, Gasper had no choice but to check the front with his naked eyes. Even squinting, he couldn't properly identify what it was. It just seemed like quite a lot of people were gathered. And if hundreds of people were suddenly gathered in their path, there was only one answer. Prepare for battle. Prepare for battle. Woa! To encounter the enemy at a point not far from San Marcos of all places. But despite the sudden order, the morale of the Spanish army wasn't broken. Rather, it soared to the sky. There was no fear in their eyes. After all, they were just slaves who hadn't received proper training. Their equipment would be poor, and there's no need to mention their lack of practical experience. Thinking this, Gasper and his soldiers moved forward, and, what is that? I don't know. Soon they were shocked by what they encountered. Soldiers in unified regulation uniforms? Quite unexpected, but possible. The appearance of enemy forces that seemed more elite than expected, and those various equipments are similar. They could have gathered what the masters and Spanish soldiers used. But the most important thing, that is, well, it was completely different from what they expected. Shortly before the Spanish arrived, Virginia Community's army arrived in Florida first. Arg!
Montagmonster.
What is that? Ah, don't you know? This is called a tractor. I don't know. Such a thing. They caused a great commotion and, we welcome Oytoten. But are you really the commander-in-chief? That's right. Then who was that person you were speaking to with honorifics earlier? Nobody. What? I said nobody. Anyway, they entered San Agustin while receiving welcomes. Then they held a meeting where the defending side must be more passive than the attacking side. Oytoten led it. The attacking side can choose the battlefield. We cannot. So what are you trying to say? I heard the natives have been won over. That's fortunate. We already had a wide area to worry about. In the end, the conclusion was simple. They needed to disperse their forces. They didn't know where the Spanish army would come from. Therefore, they had to guard all possible routes the Spanish might take. They identified about 10 spots where Spanish forces could land near San Agustin and its vicinity, placing 2 to 3 tractors at each. Local natives and liberated slaves were assigned to assist them. Of the total 40 tractors brought from Virginia, 30 were deployed for such strategic defense points. And the remaining 10 tractors? They were placed at the path connecting their last bridgehead, San Jose, to the liberated Florida. After all, the probability of entering Florida through an already secured stronghold was higher than attempting a reckless landing operation. And the remaining infantry forces were split in half, with half stationed in San Agustin and half sent with Oitoten. Thus, about 200 Virginian infantry and around 300 African liberated slaves. A total force of about 500 stood in front of approximately 1,500 Spanish troops. And the 10 tractors they had. St. Steel Monster. 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 Don't waver. Anyone who breaks formation out of panic will be hanged. That terrified the Spaniards. Gaspar immediately realized what kind of opponents were before him. No matter how he looked at it, they weren't the level of forces that could be drawn from this Florida. This meant they had either received support from abroad or others had participated. Upon this realization, Gaspar belatedly understood. Another force besides the Florida rebels has come to this region to help them? That means there was a separate entity that requested help. The subject of the rebellion. If so, this battle is no longer a simple suppression of rebellion. The Viceroyalty of Nueva España had been regarding the recent slave uprising as a massive riot that occurred amid chaotic disorder. That's why the key point of the operation plan so far was to suppress the rebellion, with the ultimate goal being to occupy all strongholds and pacify them. But now, the enemies have a unified system. The enemies have leadership. They called in their allies to participate in the war. In other words, this fight now is not a simple suppression of rebellion but a war. Moreover, more than anything else, what on earth is that thing that seems to be made of iron? Chapter 245, True Knights, 2. He couldn't win against something he didn't know. Even by rough estimation, the friendly forces seemed to be 2 or 3 times more numerous, but Gaspar couldn't afford to be careless. After being tense throughout, Gaspar pondered for a moment, then rode his horse forward. Then he shouted, "I am Gaspar, who has come here bearing the title from His Excellency Juan de Mendoza y Luna, Viceroy of the Viceroyalty of Nueva España. Let the commander among you barbarians come forth. Follow European etiquette." Suddenly everyone thought, what nonsense is this? No, it's already crazy for the commander to go to the front. But he suddenly shouts his name and affiliation and then tells the enemy commander to come forward? Who would respond to that? "Wong, I am Oitoten, Knight Commander of the Virginia Community and a member of the Council of 6 serving the Nameless One." He responded. Only then did the adjutants look at Gaspar's face. Only then did they realize his deep insight. "Good. I pledge my honor to guarantee your safety. So let's meet in the middle, commander to commander." Ha! That is European chivalry. Respect our customs. Well, if that's the case. After all, they all look like natives, so they probably don't know what European chivalry is. Don't you know honor? Fine. Therefore, if you insist that anything is European etiquette and chivalry, it can be roughly resolved. Thanks to this, Gaspar was able to extract several important facts from Oitoten's self-introduction that followed. For example, Virginia. So they came from Virginia, Gaspar said with cheers after returning. The enemies came from Virginia, and their government consists of 6 people, which they call the Council of 6. The forces that Virginia dispatched to Florida are about 500 people, and this Oitoten is the commander-in-chief. He successfully uncovered such important facts. Our knighthood originally started from farming. Have you tried our local wine? Of course you haven't. Its taste is exquisite. Enough. That's enough. I understand plenty, and was able to learn in detail things he particularly didn't want to know. What? That is a farming implement? Moreover, you're all farmers? But why knights? Did you inherit it by bloodline? What? You have a knight's license? Gasper and the rest of the command, falling into confusion, barely regained their senses and just watched the back of Oytoten, who had freely spilled all sorts of useless information and finished. Anyway, they are knights, but in an ambiguous position. They don't inherit privileges by bloodline. Their main job is plowing other people's lands, and they even have to fight. Then isn't that a serf? Not sure. Moreover, that monster is a farming implement, they say. Oytoten told most of the facts as they were. This was thanks to successfully deceiving him that fighting in such a fair and square manner was European chivalry. The Spanish army and Gasper could learn everything, including that tractors are made of steel and have moving blades attached to the front. Although they felt a bit offended by what seemed like a boastful tone. Anyway, let's just say it's all good. First, they prepared for battle. Could be seen as strange. The agricultural knight order includes many Europeans. Yet they remained silent while hearing about this bogus European etiquette, or chivalry. The reason was simple. Now that I've returned, let's attack. Please wait a moment. The enemy hasn't taken a combat stance yet. Didn't their commander ask us to wait until they're ready? Well, that's true, Sir Skinner. Do you have some insight? I don't have any special insight, but shouldn't we wait? Aren't we knights too? A very good idea. It was because the Europeans in Virginia were also half-mad. Sir Skinner, the knight captain near Chesapeake, looked ahead while feeling a thrill throughout his body. Currently, the enemies were letting their soldiers rest, loading their guns, finishing their meals, and gradually preparing. And they were restraining Oytoten, who was trying to attack them, and waiting. Because that's what is knightly. It's now 1611, an era when medieval knights have become a joke. He, who had lived his whole life as a commoner and was expected to die as one, came to the New World, became a knight captain, and went a bit crazy. Now I, too, am a knight and a noble. Of course, he's not. If King Issei, who originally created the agricultural knight system, had heard this story, he would have woken up from his nap in the San Agustin lodging and smacked the back of this crazy man's head. During World War I, the period when the Air Force as a branch first began to play an active role on the battlefield, and European countries began to earnestly cultivate pilots. While hellish trench warfare was taking place on the ground, all sorts of propaganda flourished towards the Air Force, who were fighting stylishly among themselves in the sky. Various noble youths, baited by propaganda phrases such as Knights of the Sky or aristocrats, participated in World War I as the Air Force, and they established principles like, I don't attack opponents from behind in a cowardly manner. I don't surprise attack and only fight fair and square. Naturally, such fools all died. During World War I, many Germanic noble families had their lineages cut off thanks to those fools. This is one of the main reasons why noble bloodlines became rare in England in the 20th century. Anyway, it was similar to that. No, it was worse. Moreover, they're not even nobles, and people who don't even ride horses claim to be knights and are doing crazy things intoxicated with chivalry. If King Issei had seen this, he would have burst his stomach laughing, but it couldn't be helped. Because King Issei isn't here right now. The Europeans in Virginia, including Sir Skinner, were already half crazy with intoxication, and the natives, including Oytoten, were just going along with it thinking, I guess that's how it is. So no one could stop them. At least should we try to capture the enemy's rear by performing a flanking maneuver? Cowardly. Are you even a knight saying such things? Fair and square. Then at least we should try to catch them as they cross that river. That's not honorable. Wait until the enemy forms their ranks. And honorably, Skinner and these crazy Europeans faced the Spaniards head-on. Enemies with about 3 times their number, without any advanced preparation. The Spanish leadership gradually hesitated. Isn't something wrong? Why are they listening to us so well? Just as they were whispering, wondering if all this was actually a deception and if there was a real trap. Follow me. Seeing the Virginia Agricultural Knight Order's forces charging with Sir Skinner's cry, their doubts were completely swept away. If it were a deception, they wouldn't be this sincere. I feel like I'm watching some Don Quixote. Saying this, Gaspar drew his sword and ordered an advance. For just a brief moment, simply by playing along with this pathetic fake night game, victory became this easy. After briefly deceiving them with talk of chivalry or whatever, didn't they fall for it too easily? Those Virginia barbarians, showing all sorts of clownish behavior while playing knights in their backwater. There's no way they couldn't be defeated. What an easy war. What an easy victory. With a snicker, Gaspar rushed forward with confidence. And exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes later, the Spanish army was half destroyed. Chapter 246. Excavator's Edge 1. PP please. Spare me. Where did it all go wrong? It was clearly a situation where victory was inevitable. They knew all the enemy's weaknesses and strengths, had perfectly deceived the enemy, and even had 3 times the manpower. Yet they lost. In the past 2 hours, about half the troops died right here. The rest either fled or were captured while fleeing. Like Gaspar now. Complete defeat. They lost so badly it seemed almost impossible. Boom, 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 boom. Those things are coming. Didn't they say they were made of thin steel? Shouldn't they be penetrated after being shot at a few times? Why do bullets and swords just bounce off that thing called a tractor without even touching it? With his last strength, even knowing it was meaningless, he struck the transparent wall before him with the sword he was holding. Ting! And it bounced off. The power of Lexan. Over there, it's the enemy commander. Here, take me as prisoner. At the sound calling for him, Gaspar crawls along, completely exhausted. Then he kneels before Knight Captain Sir Skinner, battered and bruised. It was useless to repeatedly brainwash his troops that those were just large lumps of iron. The very fact that those large lumps of iron were moving was shocking. No matter how many shots they fired or swords they swung, they couldn't touch them. No, those damned blades made it difficult to even approach. Just when they thought they might reach the operator, they would be pierced by enemy bullets from troops taking cover and fall. Yes, bullets. The enemy's guns were also strange. How could a force of just about 100 men wage a firepower battle against what must be over 1,000 troops and hold their own? Everything was bizarre and made no sense. How on earth? How? That gun. Don't you know? It's called Flintlock. Shut up. No, what have I done? I got so annoyed that I shouted at someone I need to surrender to. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Please take me as a prisoner. Surely there are people in my homeland who will pay a ransom for me. Thwack! Gaspar couldn't even identify what had hit him. He only realized it was the fist of Sir Skinner, whom he had mocked as Don Quixote, after hearing the shout that followed. Begging for your life is dishonorable. What honor? I just want to live right now. A dishonorable commander must be killed immediately. Come to think of it, honor seemed very important. Slightly less important than life, but still. To honor. Die by the honorable blade of a knight. Calm down. Whoa. Calm. Jurr. Gur. Honor.
Honor.
Oitoten barely manages to calm Sir Skinner, who was flailing about with his sword drawn and foam in his mouth. Watching this blankly, Gaspar just wanted to give it all up and go home. Of course, that wasn't possible. So he was sad. Equals. The Florida colony of Nueva España was operated in a form where a small number of Spaniards ruled over a majority of black slaves. The policy itself in Florida was different from other Spanish colonies. In Spanish colonies, other races, including natives, were provisional citizens who would eventually be converted to Catholicism and reborn as subjects of the Spanish Empire. The possibility for other races to be incorporated into the system was relatively open. The prohibition of native slavery existed in this context, even before Elizabeth's scheming and propaganda. However, Florida was a colony formed through rapid immigration and colonization policies. The basic framework was to import black slaves as labor for the minority Spanish rulers and then separate the Indian society from them. And as with systems like Sparta, Qing, and the Republic of South Africa, which suppressed ruled ethnicities that made up the majority of the population, Those with armed power in Spanish Florida were generally limited to Spaniards. A unique system that allowed weapons only to Spaniards and open military service to them. The force of 1,500 troops heading to Florida was indeed a precious resource. For Viceroy Juan de Mendoza, who was barely maintaining his position by establishing connections with Spain's power player, the Duke of Lerma, this was infuriating. He believed that 1,500 armed men would be more than enough to conquer Florida, yet for the results to be so meager was absurd. Despite all the talk about uprisings, weren't the rebels just slaves who didn't even know how to fight properly? They might have overwhelmed us once with sheer numbers, but to win again after that, and in open field combat? No, perhaps even more shocking than the defeat in battle was something else. Namely, the very fact that a battle took place. There was organized resistance. They thought that once they sent troops, the rebels would scatter in all directions like insects fleeing from humans. They believed that at most there would be sporadic resistance and armed conflicts, but that would be it. No one had imagined this kind of battle. But their suppression force encountered military resistance during their march, and was thus crushed miserably. Therefore, the disturbance in Florida is not simply a disorderly riot. It is a rebellion with a subject. If so, the chaos in Florida is not a problem that can be solved by simple suppression. This is war. And war ends when the enemy leadership is subjugated. What is needed right now is not the arduous process of suppression forces invading various areas to restore order. What is needed right now is a decapitation operation. The officials of Nueva España carefully gathered information. They asked passing merchants and fled slave owners. When did you say Florida began to collapse simultaneously? After the fall of San Agustin. Where was the problematic priest last seen? In San Agustin. Which port in modern Florida has the most ships coming and going? San Agustin. That'll do. And after compiling the information they gathered, Juan de Mendoza y Luna ran calculations in his head. If they don't want to give up their control over the entirety of Florida, the leadership of the rebellion must necessarily be located in San Agustin. Even if the rebellion's leader isn't there, it doesn't matter. After all, Florida's road network radiates from that one city, so they can conquer other cities as well. If they seize San Agustin, the rebel forces can be instantly divided and conquered. San Agustin. Juan de Mendoza swallowed, sensing that this would be the last order he would give as the viceroy of this place. He would either overcome this ordeal and be promoted to viceroy of Peru, or be broken here and demoted forever. Moreover, request support from the homeland as well. Whether he could block the blade aiming at the empire's throat depended on this. Massive forces were mobilized. The colonial governing machine, which had grown since the reign of Philip II, moved at maximum output. Florida's defense plan was quite complex. This was due to the situation the new government of Florida found itself in. The Spanish government nurtured various strongholds to control and dominate the sparsely populated land of Florida, and then planned road networks and spread administrative networks centered on the stronghold of strongholds. That was San Agustin. Chapter 247. Excavator's Edge. 2. San Agustin was the brain and heart of Spanish Florida. Like most Spanish Florida strongholds, it was a fortress and village built on the coast. From this land, where about 3,000 people resided, the Florida governor issued orders to each stronghold, and from those strongholds, extended influence to various Indian tribes and villages. For this purpose, a dense and sophisticated road network was woven around San Agustin, and the system was organized so that the Florida governor could immediately intervene if problems arose anywhere. Of course, as a counterbalance, slave rebellions from various places converged on San Agustin, and the entire Florida colony was overturned. The importance of San Agustin remained even at this moment when the rulers of this land had changed. Whoever controls this coastal fortress controls the entirety of Florida. Therefore, in the Spanish reinvasion of Florida that would be attempted, this place was virtually the front line. Targeting the enemy's heart is a basic strategy. Moreover, San Agustin is a coastal fortress. From the perspective of Spaniards with naval power, Attacking this place itself isn't easy. However, here, the war tractors, the pride of the Virginia Agricultural Knight Order, become useless. If we enumerate the characteristics of war tractors made in our Virginia, they are as follows. Weight exceeding 30 tons on average. Speed and power still insufficient despite maximizing the output of the steam engine. Drive system that relies solely on large wheels, with no special means to move over rough terrain. Naturally, they were prone to being neutralized even just near mudflats, let alone sand beaches. Rolling over even slightly rough terrain, war tractors would spread out in place, and ultimately, tractors struggled to be effective without the prerequisite conditions of solid ground, flat terrain, and easy access to water and fuel. Meanwhile, the area around San Augustine, as mentioned earlier, has geographical conditions where several rivers meet the sea. Even after being developed for over 10 years, wetlands still abound throughout. It's the worst place for tractors to operate. It's particularly difficult for tractors to be effective in defensive battles to begin with. And tractors are already deployed in positions favorable for their activities, to block potential invasion routes of the Spanish army. In other words, San Augustine is a battlefield where tractors struggle to be effective. Moreover, because it has the sea right in front, it has a dangerous location that can be directly exposed to invasions via sea routes. Therefore, this place is most vulnerable to enemy attacks. The new government of Florida is located in San Augustine, because this is the center of Florida. Moreover, San Augustine has the necessary conditions to immediately extend influence throughout Florida. If this place is lost, it would be instantaneous for the entirety of Florida to be trampled under their feet again. So this place cannot be abandoned either. No one knows what kind of battle will unfold in this San Augustine, but one thing was certain. The battle here will determine the fate of Florida going forward. I watched the San Marcos fortress from afar, then quietly returned and lit a fire near my tent. As I was quietly grilling some freshly hunted rabbit meat by the fire, someone approached from a distance. Thud, and sits right next to me. I feel gazes around. Numerous eyes shine in the darkness, looking this way. Why don't they approach? When I asked, the bishop of the underground organization answered. They consider it irreverent to directly touch an angel. When I told them to follow, they said they would watch from a distance. A total of 1,200 people have gathered. This is the number of liberated free people who have gathered from all over Florida to protect San Augustine. That's good news. It was only possible because you are here. Gathering 1,500 soldiers in that fortress is truly close to a miracle. Saying this, the bishop pointed to the fortress faintly visible beyond the horizon. Even now at night, it was visible from kilometers away, brightly lit with torches to guard the surroundings. Inside, people who had never been properly trained and didn't even know how to shoot a gun until recently would be awkwardly maintaining their positions and learning how to read flag signals. I cut the grilled meat into pieces and put it in my mouth. It was tough and smelly, but edible. Were you eating? It's fine. Please stay seated, Bishop. I wonder if I caused confusion by falsely assuming the role of a priest when I'm not well versed in doctrine. Not at all. The church has already resolved to formally appoint you as a bishop. Whether you're well versed in doctrine or not, can't they do at least that much for someone who has fought for the liberation of slaves for over 10 years? And gathering about 1,000 soldiers is also an achievement you all accomplished. I just came here and watched you all. When I commanded the escape of slaves, you broke the shackles that made slaves into slaves. It is an achievement you all accomplished, and there is not a single point where my name should be elevated. My words were sincere. After all, I never imagined Florida would be overturned like this in just a few years. In the end, it was those who had set foot here who created this miraculous situation, not some grape farmer who secretly helped them from afar. So, believe in yourselves. We believe in you. Don't believe in me. The outcome is in your hands. Believe in what you will accomplish in your land. Right now, all I can do is offer encouragement for the coming war and commend what has been achieved so far. Even if people exalt me as an angel or whatever, I'm just an ordinary person. How many Spanish troops will come? I don't know. I don't have the power to magically eliminate all those enemies, nor the knowledge or ability to predict how the war will unfold. I will believe in you all." At those words, the gazes watching me from around shook and blinked. Then several disappeared. As the bishop also greeted me and was about to withdraw, I added one more thing. "However, I will help you all as much as I can."
Top.
After tapping the object behind me, I picked up the last piece of meat and put it in my mouth, and then, there was no one around. It seemed acting secretively had become their habit, typical of the leaders of a secret organization. I dusted off my hands, stood up, and looked at the tent behind me. And in front of it, the massive object, taller than a person, wrapped in tent cloth. As mentioned earlier, war tractors are difficult to use near San Agustin. What were the disadvantages of our war tractors again? Absurdly heavy weight exceeding 30 tons. The pitiful output of an engine that barely produces a few horsepower. A drive system made of simple wheels that becomes useless when stuck in mud. Because of this, war tractors cannot be used in this area, which is mostly wetlands. But if the weight is reduced to about 10 tons, making it relatively lighter, and if it can be propelled with powerful force easily exceeding 100 horsepower, if it has a drive system made of continuous tracks that can easily escape most rough terrain, that war weapon can be handled even in this land full of sand and wetlands. That's right. Roa Air. My excavator can be effective even here. As I removed the tent cloth, the excavator, armored with Lexan and steel, gleamed menacingly. Chapter 248. Excavator's Edge 3. Everything, all collapsed? Yes. After the entire Florida colony fell to the slave rebellion, our colony is under threat. We must make a decision as soon as possible. That's why I said I should have captured Queen Elizabeth back then. Then the war could have been over already. The Duke of Lerma held back a sigh and gave the king a gentle smile. It's regrettable. Truly incompetent ones have ruined your majesty's grand plans. It's good for a king to be stupid. It makes him suitable for manipulation. But it's problematic if he's stupid beyond a certain limit. It makes the country unstable. The relocation to Valladolid has been completed, and there's no need to keep the king's attention away from the New World anymore. No, in the current situation where Moriscos, those who converted from Islam to Catholicism, or those who secretly maintained Islamic faith under Catholic monarchs, were forcibly expelled for political gain, it was even more necessary to turn the king's eyes to the New World. Through other achievements, the economic depression following the expulsion of the Moriscos needed to be covered up. But if I had captured the queen then, if only I had. Look at him, still grumbling and complaining about something that happened years ago. Surprisingly, this person without dignity or majesty is King Philip III of Spain. He shows not even a speck of a king's boldness or leadership. Anyway, shouldn't we recapture Florida immediately? There's a knife coming to our throat. Still, a rotten fish is better than no fish. As king, he seems to have noticed what the problem is. That's fortunate. That's right. If Florida falls into the hands of rebels and heretics, our fleet crossing the Atlantic will be threatened more frequently. Right? Where is our lifeline? We cannot just stand by. Philip III, with trembling hands, gives instructions to the Duke of Lerma.
Yes.
Didn't you say Ireland has almost been stabilized? Then if we pull troops from there and send them across the Atlantic. Yes, that would work. Then do so immediately. Thud. Anywhere else is fine, but not America. Isn't it the monarchical land flowing with gold that our ancestors left us? Philip III, for the first time in a very long time, or perhaps for the first time ever, firmly gives an order.
The reinforcements requested by Juan de Mendoza y Luna.
Give him everything he wants. Don't let that English witch and Indian chief set foot on my land. Thus, Juan de Aguila, who had been stationed in Ireland watching local nobles quarrel, immediately crossed the Atlantic and took charge of the troops mobilized by Viceroy Juan de Mendoza of Nueva España. And so, Good heavens! Why are you... 6,600 men. A total of 6,600 troops prepared to conquer San Agustin, sweep through Florida, and then bring down Virginia. About 10 times the Virginianite order, and 4 times the total number of people including the troops stationed in San Agustin and the rest of the residents. Divided among about 20 large warships, they reached the waters off Florida directly. Virginia's sailors, led by Vicente, cooperating with 5 or 6 English ships, tracked and attacked them in nearby waters, but they were overwhelmed by numerical inferiority. Sinking one supply ship carrying gunpowder and food was the limit of what they could achieve. Thus, forces amounting to 4 times what Florida had managed to squeeze out landed on Anastasia Island, Isla Anastasia, an island located east of San Agustin. More numerous, stronger, and better trained forces. Good heavens! Even with the war in Europe, how? The word someone threw out like a scream did nothing to alleviate the feeling of despair among those gathered here. The Spanish authorities concluded that suppressing the rebellion in Florida was more important than confronting various enemies in Europe. It was a statement with no function other than reminding them of this depressing fact. Having thought that about 1,500 people would be sufficient to defend this place, they were all shocked into silence. The numerical disadvantage was so great that they couldn't even attempt to prevent the Spaniards from landing. Rather, if they had picked a fight outside the fortress, they might have been badly beaten by the landing soldiers. The enemy first landed on Anastasia Island, then slowly dominated the surrounding waters and is firing cannon shots at the fortress. Boom! Boom boom! The content of the report was unnecessary. The distant explosions and vibrations were enough to instill fear in the meeting members gathered here. Their muttering in shock was unbearably gloomy. Father Alonso Garcia, unable to bear the sight, tried to stand up but listened to someone's voice. What about him? What does he say we should do? Him. Without a proper name or title, everyone knew who was being referred to. He who had come with the Virginianite order and quietly, but definitely, revealed his presence while staying near San Agustin. At least a third of those present believed him to be an angel. And Alonso, right now, the enemies outside are many times more numerous than us. Belonged to the group that made up less than 2/3. Alonso, half angered by the thoughtless words of the person who had just spoken, said, "It's foolish to expect much to change with the help of just one person." He is not just one person, right? He is. I don't care what you believe him to be, but I just stated the obvious. In fact, Alonso didn't entirely refrain from expecting something facing this desperate battle. The one responsible for liberating countless slaves and the Emperor of Virginia. It would be stranger not to expect something from such a person. But, so, believe in yourselves. He, seen from afar, was a normal human in Alonso's eyes. Some trembled and wept as if receiving the Holy Spirit, hearing voices in numerous languages. But Alonso wasn't easily moved by that miracle. Because ultimately, as he himself said, the outcome depended not on him but on those gathered here. What liberated the slaves here into free people was their own courage, not an angel from far away. He could be a helper but not a savior. Bubiyu but the nameless one. Yet some acted as if he would solve all problems. Alonso disliked those who blindly followed him more than him himself. It's not like praying alone will solve everything. Eventually, Alonso quietly left the meeting in the midst of people's debates and climbed the wall. There, while their defensive forces could do nothing, Spaniards were crossing the Matanzas River under the cover of naval gunfire. Some soldiers struggled to fire cannons, but they hit nothing. "Father Alonso, why are you here? Go inside. Quickly." Despite a soldier's urging, Alonso's feet wouldn't move. Thousands of Spanish troops had already landed on the shore like ants swarming around sugar. They were slowly forming ranks and walking with ladders. The sight formed a terrible contrast with the Allied forces scattering in all directions, panicked by the cannon fire. I don't like this. Spanish Royal Army Captain Francisco clicked his tongue as he glared at the San Marcos fortress. When the naval gunfire stopped, the command immediately gave the order to charge. They approached the wall carefully, avoiding the disorderly gunfire shower from the enemy. They thought it would be easy to fill the moat, raise ladders, and feed bullets to those clumsy enemies running around between the battlements. Fire. Rat-tat-tat-tat. But it was different from expectations. Something transparent was blocking between the battlements. When they tried to shoot after seeing enemies poking their heads out, often it was their own soldiers who got shot instead. Rat-tat-tat. Arg. I am hit. Move the wounded to the back. Chapter 249. Excavator's Edge. 4. Moreover, the speed at which the enemies loaded and fired their guns was so fast that even seasoned soldiers struggled to keep up. Surely they are just a rabble. Surely they are nothing. Yet they were strangely strong. Although they didn't know it was due to Lexan shields and flintlock muskets, everyone felt that strange sensation. Despite overwhelmingly superior skill and numbers on their side, the enemy was somehow holding out. This makes no sense. They shouldn't even be able to hold out. When did those slaves ever receive military training? That very fact that they could stand against seasoned soldiers who had rolled through Ireland, the Low Countries, and various places was unpleasant and difficult to comprehend. Francisco, pull your soldiers back right now. Another company is advancing. Understood. And the command seemed to be feeling such anomalies sufficiently as well. They had advanced boldly, but after suffering significant casualties, they were retreating to distance themselves from the enemy. It seemed like it would be a protracted battle with both sides just bombarding each other for days, forcing casualties on each other. Other captains who realized this fact were clicking their tongues, spitting, and cursing. For now, they were slowly retreating under the cover of naval gunfire. It's fine. Soon, large siege cannons will land on the shore. Once the cannons being inspected on Anastasia Island arrive, they can pound those walls much more powerfully than the sporadic naval gunfire from a distance. Even their strange armaments won't be able to do anything about that. If that happens, the battle becomes easier. If that happens, tap-tap, Tach there. What is it, Lieutenant? Francisco, annoyed at the interruption of his thoughts, turned around, and suddenly Lieutenant Juan pointed to the distance with a trembling finger. Something is coming there. What do you mean something is coming? Saying this, Francisco turned his head and, for a moment, just a moment, he lost his words. Everything about this battlefield was strange. Those clumsy slaves, though trembling with fear, were somehow achieving decent results. Strangely, when aiming and shooting at the enemy, there would be a sound as if bouncing off something, and the enemy would return unscathed. Among all that, what? Francisco seemed to have just seen the strangest thing of all. Several cavalrymen are charging towards our troops, firing guns. Well, that's possible. It seems some enemy reserves were waiting outside the fortress. Although their numbers are insignificant, about 30. But, among those cavalrymen, coo-coo-coo-coo. Something approaching with a roaring sound. Coo-coo-coo-coo. That something captured the soldiers' gaze and made them stop in their tracks. It made everyone open their mouths and quietly recite prayers. What are you all doing? Shoot at least. Rat-tat-tat-tat. When someone shouted boldly, the gunners finally regained their senses and began loading and firing from various positions. While several cavalrymen fell, that something rushing among them still didn't fall. It's the same as before. Just like when rushing to the fortress earlier, bullets are bounced off. Realizing this fact, the gunners began to back away, increasingly scared. Coo-coo-coo-coo. The roaring sound gets louder, and the image of that something, which was only vaguely visible, gradually becomes clearer. It could only be expressed as truly something, because there were no words in the world yet to describe it. It was It looked like a monster crudely imitating the Lord's creation, made by the devil. With a huge yellow body, spikes and blades protruding here and there resembled the externally protruding teeth of a monster. A massive neck extending upward from between them supported a large head with a big mouth. The wheels underneath rolled frantically, climbing over slopes and rocks like a snake, approaching him. The soldiers, collectively terrified, backed away, throwing stones and firing guns. Some brave ones tried to approach and swing their swords. Thud. But Sanchez is dead. Dead. What? How can that huge thing be so fast? That massive thing. What are you doing, Capitan? Please escape quickly. Fast. Captain? Captain. To Francisco. Damn it, what are you doing? Run. Fast. When Francisco blinked for a moment, the monster was right in front of him. And there was a person inside the monster. Their eyes met briefly. For 1 second. Bang. That was his last memory. Crack. Many began to shout about the monster spewing black smoke and started to flee. The formation of hundreds collapsed, and thousands wavered.
Puis poursuit.
Quickly. But it was too fast for the soldiers to chase in pursuit. Before the Spaniards could even guess its identity, it disappeared beyond their sight. They didn't dare to attack the fortress again. The losses themselves aren't significant. However, since that thing seriously disrupted our formation, it could be a big problem if we're not careful. You're worrying too much. If the enemy had cavalry numbering in the tens or hundreds capable of striking us, I'd understand. But even if our formation temporarily collapses, the enemy doesn't have the means to strike our forces. Do you folks do mathematics? What? If you only look at what can be counted for convenience, sometimes you miss important things. Spanish Army Commander Juan del Aguila said to his subordinates who were reporting. Think about it. Really, is that all? I'm asking if that's the full extent of the damage our army has suffered. Dozens dead and injured, formation disrupted, reorganization delayed because of it. Is that all I'm asking? Everyone fell silent at the commander's words. Juan del Aguila, unable to contain the anger rising in his old body, panted and then lifted the tent to look into the eyes of the soldiers reorganizing nearby. Their eyes should have been filled with certainty of victory. And that certainty actually creates victory. He had learned this painfully over the past few decades. But what dwells in their eyes now is not certainty, confidence, or fighting spirit. It's fear. And the most terrible kind of fear. What on earth is that thing? Fear of the unknown. Something they don't even know is coming to kill them. That monster made of iron, that monster rushing with a terrible roar, is on the side of the enemy. Some are spreading rumors that those primitive slaves used evil sorcery to summon a demon. Some are embellishing stories of terrifying monsters, collecting fragments of Indian legends and folk tales. That fact alone is breaking the will to fight of the entire Spanish army. The human casualties and equipment damage can be counted, but fear cannot be counted. Nevertheless, that fear was spreading like a fatal epidemic in the army. Soldiers refused to stand at the front, resort to praying among themselves, or rely on all sorts of superstitions. There's only one way to reverse this situation. How prepared are San Pedro and San Lorenzo? Overwhelming victory. Just by Juan del Aguila mentioning those names, the fear momentarily lifts from his adjutant's eyes. It seems preparations can be made in 4 to 5 days. Expedite it. As much as possible. They had forgotten for a moment the fact that they must win this battle. Chapter 250, Excavator's Edge, 5. Days had already passed since the battle began. Those born in America, raise your hands and speak. Does anyone know what that monster is? Over here. Speak. In my view, that monster seems to be some kind of machine. It doesn't appear to be alive. Who doesn't know that? Bang! Would Indian barbarians have made such a thing? Or was it those English pirates? No. We need to know who made it, how they made it, and what its weakness is. Spanish Army Commander Juan del Aguila y Arellano still couldn't forget the form of that monster. Something covered in spikes all over its body like a deep-sea fish. Something bigger than a person, made of metal. That something ran faster than a horse. No matter how they tried to catch it, they couldn't. Clearly heavy enough to make the ground sink where it passed, yet bizarrely agile at the same time. Because of this, thousands of troops had been toyed with by that monster for days now. Juan del Aguila barely contained his boiling anger as he glared at the distant San Marcos fortress. So simple. Just bringing down that one fortress would practically end everything. He even mocked the people of the Viceroyalty of Nueva España for failing to accomplish such an easy task. And as he gradually realized that this Florida might become his final battlefield, he also pondered how to honorably conclude this campaign. It was a foolish concern. Instead of indulging in such luxury, he should have thought more intensely. He should have considered why Nueva España struggled so much to suppress a mere slave rebellion. Of course, even this realization comes too late. Juan del Aguila shook his head and said to those around him, "Fine. If no one knows, then let's just hurry as we decided before." He shouldn't have been greedy to quickly occupy the fortress in the first place. He should have endured until that was ready before engaging in battle. The Spanish commander quickly regained his reason. Good. If the enemies have peculiar weapons and bizarre monsters accompanying them, we have iron and bronze. We'll crush that miserable fortress. Equals. Yeah, Juan. After a long time, a truly long time, the guard standing next to Alonso yawned. Considering the fierce battles that had been ongoing, there shouldn't have been time to yawn leisurely like that. That's how it had been for the past few days. But lately it was different. Can you tell what they're preparing? I don't know. The Spaniards were digging, piling earth on hills near the shore, and making all sorts of commotion, but they couldn't even guess the reason. It was because the Spanish troops' defensive formation surrounding that suspicious construction site was so dense. For the past few days, the enemy had focused more on gaining psychological advantage and intimidation rather than direct attacks on the fortress. Occasionally, part of their forces would circle around the walls, blowing trumpets and demonstrating, then return to their original defensive formation when it was time. With them taking such an extremely defensive attitude in front of the fortress, the defenders had no opportunity to do anything. What is it? What are they trying to do? Especially from Kin Issei's perspective, it was even more so. For him, diving into such a defensive formation would be suicidal. If he were to pour the excavator's impact into such a dense formation, the vehicle would eventually stop in the middle of enemy lines. That's why he had only surprised their rear in situations where the Spanish soldiers were appropriately scattered and focused on attacking the fortress. If the enemies responded properly even once, Kin Issei would instantly become their prisoner. Then it would be over. Anyway, although he had an ominous feeling about what might be completed, Kin Issei could only bite his thumbnail without being able to do anything. The feeling of just watching without being able to do anything, regardless of what it was, wasn't very pleasant. Kin Issei tried to poke around the defensive formation several times, and drove away detached units that separated from the formation to threaten the fortress, but the Spanish army remained unshaken. Indeed, it seemed that some important work was continuing inside. But since he himself couldn't know what it was, he could only feel frustrated. Then one day, now something was clearly noticeable. The defensive formation was moving. They were surrounding a huge cart pulled by dozens of people at its center. It was impossible to know what was in that cart. It was because it was wrapped in black cloth. Kin Issei urgently unfolded a telescope and even took photos to enlarge them, but he couldn't confirm anything from that vague silhouette. However, two things were certain. Unless they had given up on the war, that is a weapon. One that helps the former. Also, whatever weapon it is, it's very heavy. These two pieces of information floated around in everyone's minds for a moment, and combined, a very heavy weapon needed for siege warfare. Swoosh! Cannon. As the black cloth slid down, a massive metal body appeared, reflecting sunlight. Cannons of a size that would have been threatening even if there was just one were quickly positioned in pairs, aiming at the fortress. These siege cannons, ordered by the Viceroy of Nueva España, Juan de Mendoza y Luna, partly as a display of wealth. No one could have imagined they would be used like this. Juan del Aguila stroked the elegant barrel, large enough for even a child to enter, with a sigh of relief. The twin giant cannons San Pedro and San Lorenzo, with barrels measuring 4 meters in length, cast in Chapultepec, Mexico City, under the orders of Juan de Mendoza y Luna, Viceroy of Nueva España and Marquis of Montesclaros. These powerful bronze cannons were truly monsters. Their overwhelming size, requiring more than a dozen horses to move, made one question whether these cannons were really made for actual combat. Even Juan del Aguila pondered for a long time whether it was right to load these enormous white elephants onto ships. But loading. Now he would know if the result of that contemplation was correct. The Spanish commander, a seasoned general who had gone through numerous battlefields including France, the Netherlands, Milan, Sicily, Malta, and more, smiled. He had a very pleasant premonition. Soon, a world-shaking roar spread, and amid several soldiers falling in surprise or covering their ears and complaining of pain, he could barely see through the smoke. Finally, both that cursed transparent barrier and that terrible wall were half demolished. Spanish soldiers charged with cheers, and the soldiers of the Florida rebels scattered and were crushed while bleeding profusely. It was a moment when the distinction between people and chunks of meat became ambiguous. At the same time, the distinction between walls and piles of stones became blurred. Grab weapons! Grab weapons! They shouted in despair, and they fired at the countless Spaniards who were swarming with ladders. This time, no one was safe. A bloody battle ensued. What is that? Like a sand castle collapsing under a wave, hopelessly, 1/3 of the wall on one side of the San Marcos fortress crumbled. As some terrified soldiers tried to flee, others grabbed them by the collar and kept them in their original positions, and soldiers who barely maintained their formation frantically fired guns while standing on the corpses of their comrades. While some Spanish soldiers unluckily fell to those blind bullets, there were still many Spaniards. They numbered over 6,000. They had barely managed to push back with Lexan shields and flintlocks the hand-to-hand combat that had broken out on the fortress walls. By kicking away a few ladders and then falling one after another amid the pouring crossfire, people were just barely managing to block the Spanish advance with difficulty. And watching that scene through a telescope, I momentarily lost my words. With such weapons in the enemy's hands, there was no way to win. Even if they held out now, despair would grow from where those siege cannons spewed fire again. Little by little, as weaknesses were exposed and walls were chipped away, there would be a significant limit to how much repairs with palisades and urgent soil could help. Chapter 251. Excavator's Edge, 6. There was no way they could hold out until the next day. That's right. With the appearance of those things, defeat was predetermined. I realized I was unconsciously gritting my teeth. I was clenching my fist so hard that the veins in my forearm were bulging. I was angry. I should have noticed earlier what was in the enemy's defensive formation. No, even if I hadn't noticed, I should have rammed into it at the risk of danger before things got this far. If they were maintaining their guard so strictly, something that important must be inside. Rather, meaningless regret grew in my mind. I shook my head to dispel useless self-blame and regret, then looked at the enemy camp through the telescope again. There, still receiving escort from a well-formed defensive formation, that giant cannon was preparing to spew fire. As if the Spanish army's attack until just now had been some kind of warm-up. The people in the fortress had barely been able to block even that with all their might. When the cannon spewed fire again, the game would be over. Florida would be enslaved again. Furthermore, it was obvious that the night order forces scattered throughout Florida for defense would be picked off one by one. And if Florida fell completely back into their hands, the Florida colony would no longer be for defense. It would become a forward base for invading Virginia. And our community of just over 100,000 people doesn't have the capacity to block that attack. There's no way to have the ability to block the invasion of the strongest European country of the era. Many fates are divided here. I close my eyes for a moment and weigh. I weigh the worst case that could arise from my actions and the sacrifice that would occur if we were defeated in this battle without doing anything. In the worst case, I am captured by the Spanish army. And in case of defeat here, tens of thousands die and are enslaved. And I open my eyes again. I don't think I'm a human with extraordinary courage or morality. I'm just an ordinary grape farmer who, luckily or unluckily, fell into the 16th century with all sorts of cheats. Anyone who faced the same conditions as me could act like me. Ha! Well, it's not like I'm going to die. If there's someone destined to live forever with nothing to lose, that is, I no longer hesitated, because for a person promised eternity, all pain is just momentary, because these are things that will pass after gritting your teeth for a while. Looking at it that way, saving people from a hurricane, and all other things are just things I tried because I could. I pulled the lever, and I neither slowed down nor turned direction even once. In a perfectly straight line, I launched myself toward the target. Please, please, if we just hold out a little longer. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Another person died. Recklessly, they rushed forward with a gun and shield, and eventually fell within seconds to crossfire coming from all directions. But those few seconds were enough. It was enough for other soldiers to barely rebuild the fence with Lexan and planks and establish a defensive line. And boom, 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 boom. Collapsed again. Rat-tat-tat. Dying again. Gee, get up. Get up. I said bring some planks. Building again. Repeating the cycle of collapsing again and dying. It was desperate. A defensive line drawn with someone's blood was trampled and erased so trivially. Someone's entire life concluded so emptily with a few gunshots. The time this took was just a few seconds, a few minutes. That tormented Alonso. He bandaged wounds and splinted fractures of those brought to the rear with blood-soaked hands. But he couldn't tell if there was any meaning in all those actions. In the end, it seemed like everyone here would die. It seemed like everything would return to before the rebellion. That fact was so sorrowful that Alonso burst into tears without even realizing it. Alonso staggered to his feet, covered in. He leaned his shaking body against the wall and slowly climbed the stairs. Surely a shower of bullets would still be continuing up there, but he wanted to see anyway. How the battle situation was progressing, how the impending doom was approaching. Thus, half out of his mind, he climbed all the stairs and cast his gaze outside the wall. And, he saw the sophisticated and dense defensive formation of the Spaniards. That enormous, damnable bronze cannon positioned within that formation. And, vroom! His tank boring through toward it. Something impossible was happening. Something impossible. Fear fills the eyes of the Spaniards. Take there. The monster is coming. Stop it. Stop it. Arg. Shoot. Shoot. Aim at the driver there. The bullets are being blocked. Even if you have to climb on top, grab it. Arg. It's like hell. Countless people fall screaming before me. The barbed wire attached all around the excavator is entangled with human skin, flesh, and blood, creating a horrific scene. Still, I kept running. Bang! Hook! Just now, for the second time, a bullet pierced through my chest. So even Lexan plates get tattered when hundreds of shots are fired at ultra-close range. Thud! Again, for the 10th-something time, the impact of a traffic accident is inflicted on my entire body as I collide with people. The unpleasant sensation of vertebrae being dislocated and then realigned awakens my mind. I gritted my teeth and pulled the lever again. I pressed on, not caring whether things were crushed under the wheels or whether the already broken wipers cleaned the blood or not. Fire! Rat-tat-tat-tat. A bullet grazes my temple, turning my brain into mush before it recovers. The muscle fibers in my arm are completely torn apart by bullets before returning to normal. Both hands gripping the left and right levers tremble. My arms repeatedly stiffen and then relax. I rotate the upper part several times to shake off the Spaniards clinging to it, then let go of the levers and pick up a chainsaw to fend off a Spaniard approaching me through the gap in the Lexan. That's how I become covered in blood. Even covered in blood, I continue to advance. Smoke seems to be rising from somewhere in the excavator, but I don't stop. Like I'm going to die. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Coup hook. Blood rises again due to a bullet penetrating my neck. I accelerate, dripping blood from my mouth. Like that. Stop it. The enemy is moving toward the cannon. I reached those terrible monster cannons. Warning sounds seem to be beeping from everywhere. No, maybe it's a sound ringing in my ears because I'm too tired. It's okay. It will be over soon. Don't let it go to the cannon. Huh? Who? Fools. What could I do to that huge cannon? Could I destroy it? Only when facing those who were blocking the way between me and the cannon did I change direction for the first time. Right near the cannon. No. Stop it. Stop it right now. Stop it. To where the gunpowder is gathered. I opened the rattling door with a kick while taking out a lighter from my pocket. And I threw it. Still anxious, I rammed once more with the smoking vehicle. And as I think about it one last time, wow, this is gonna hurt more than when my body was burned last time. Boom, 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 boom. A pillar of fire rose. Equals. Both the Spaniards and the freemen of Florida could only watch in a daze as the massive explosion erupted among the Spanish troops. Flames engulfed everything. Chapter 252. Made from Dust 1. The battle momentarily froze. The vibration and explosion that erupted was impossible for anyone to ignore. Everyone engaged in the battle could see the column of fire and smoke rising in the distance. Both the Spanish forces and the Florida forces, who had been trying to kill each other moments ago, fell silent and stared. They couldn't shout, whether in cheer or scream. After all, one needs to understand what has happened before reacting. They just stood there, bewildered, watching the chaos unfold. Except for one person. Alonso Garcia knew exactly what had caused that pillar of fire. Collision. The Spanish cannons and his monster had collided, and everything had gone up in flames. The Spanish formation immediately collapsed amidst the explosion that engulfed the powder magazine, the tank, and everything else. Naturally, those terrible cannons couldn't have survived such an explosion either. But that wasn't what mattered. He was in those flames. If he were truly an angel, perhaps he wouldn't die. But Alonso couldn't be sure of anything. For a moment, his mind went blank. The outcome is in our hands, they said. What was all this for? Come on. Snap out of it. The commander beside Alonso shouted urgently. The soldiers who had been standing in a daze for several seconds began to return to their senses. Advance. Advance now. That command froze the soldiers again. Advance? Even though the enemy's formation had collapsed, they were still outnumbered. How could they advance when they had been under attack just moments ago? But the next words quickly silenced the soldiers' doubts. There won't be another chance. Hurry! Didn't the angel strike down our enemies? The Spanish soldiers, still dazed, took longer to recover from the shock. The sudden terrible fire erupting from their main force must have confused them. And when they finally regained their senses, Florida! They crumbled under the Florida forces' attack. About 1,000 soldiers opened the fortress gates and charged forward as one. Being stabbed by a sword, the feeling isn't exactly pleasant. That foreign sensation of cold metal forcing its way into a place it shouldn't be. Having limbs severed feels terrible too. Something that was just a part of me, an extension of myself, instantly becomes a meaningless chunk of meat lying before me. When the body burns, it's as if thousands of needles prick my body with pain, and muscles contract involuntarily as the body malfunctions. In truth, many people have probably experienced similar sensations in daily life. Paper cuts are common, mistakes happen while handling kitchen knives, and everyone has experienced being briefly burned by something hot. But Experiencing all of that at once is probably not easy. I felt my entire body burning. Simultaneously, I felt my entire body being torn to pieces. A few seconds stretched into an eternity. Everything was engulfed in red flames, and I couldn't even see my own limbs properly. No, even before trying to see anything, my eyes were already destroyed. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even struggle freely. In pain beyond limits, my nerves malfunctioned and sent random commands everywhere, while my blood escaped to places it shouldn't. My body was completely ruined. At some point, I couldn't even feel the pain anymore. I lost all control over my body. As my consciousness separated from all bodily sensations, complete nothingness surrounded me. Even thinking became increasingly difficult. I could feel only the most basic form of consciousness precariously continuing like a thin thread. Usually, one step beyond this state is what we call death. I am in the process of moving toward death. Amid the flames, fragments, and thunderous noise, my body and mind are being torn apart and burned, as if I had never existed in the first place. But I don't die. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Genesis 1 verse 2 == Gee, good heavens! What's happening? Pour some water. It burns even more when we pour water. Stop. Get rid of that water container now. If that's oil. The flames that consumed the petroleum and gunpowder wouldn't be easily extinguished. The Spanish forces desperately brought water and sand from everywhere to pour on the massive explosion at the center of their formation. But the weather was dry. The flames darted their nimble tongues, chasing after grass, clothing, and anything combustible, making the fire grow rather than diminish. The sergeant major has lost consciousness. Evacuate the officers first. Hurry! What's more, the command post was located at the center of the formation, the safest and most defensively positioned spot. Naturally, even the Spanish forces had kept some distance between their command post and artillery for safety. But when Kin Issei's excavator and all the gathered gunpowder unexpectedly exploded, the impact reached the command post. Commander! See Commander! Cook! Huck! Juan de Aguila, in his 60s, collapsed after inhaling toxic smoke, and many other officers were also knocked unconscious, killed, or injured. The Spanish command center was paralyzed. Meanwhile, freedom, ratatating. Finally, the enemy troops emerged from the fortress and stood before them. Those inexperienced slaves who had been hiding behind transparent shields and fortress walls, mocking the elite troops. However, the Spanish soldiers weren't pleased to be greeted by the enemy. They were terrified. They had to stop fighting the fire and form a formation to repel the enemy attack. In the middle of that formation, as the fire demon still raged, while the headless Spanish forces could barely move, huddled together to prevent disintegration, the Florida forces, supported by Virginia, were able to display their strengths fully. Load, chukchuk, fire, ratatating. Traditional matchlock muskets required soldiers to maintain distance from each other to keep their match cords burning. Moreover, having to light and maintain the fuse made it extremely difficult to time the shots after loading. But flintlock muskets were different. Once loaded, they could be fired at any desired moment, which meant fire.
Ratatatatang.
Volley fire became much easier. Of course, the newly liberated slaves who had only recently been trained could hardly properly execute the linear infantry volley fire that Kin Issei had unknowingly introduced. To suppress individual survival instincts and concentrate firepower in a short time solely according to collective will, while enemy blades and bullets approached. Chapter 253. Made from Dust 2. It required much deeper proficiency than Kin Issei had thought. However, even a poor imitation was sufficiently shocking. Fire! An awkward and clumsy imitation. But firearms so overwhelmingly advanced that they completely overshadowed that clumsiness. The desperate fighting spirit of people who knew there was no retreat. The firing net created by all these factors. Arg! Don't retreat. Pikemen advance. We'll all die if we advance. Would you rather die meaninglessly here? It was still enough to overwhelm the Spanish. In the sporadically formed firing net, the Spanish died without being able to escape. Several companies attempted to advance for close combat as they were outgunned, but they had no proper command or support. There was no command center to paint the big picture of the battle and control numerous limbs. The outcome of 10 fingers trying to play a tune separately was predictable. Rat-a-tating, the advancing companies, without proper support, only jutted forward and suffered crossfire. Those who didn't advance missed their opportunity to strike the enemy. And so, damn it, finally! After a series of painful defeats, the Spanish in the rear finally extinguished the flames defending their position. They were drenched in cold sweat, aware of the hardships at the front. They saw the remains of melted and collapsed metal fragments, and the remnants of people, grass, and wood that had been burned. The smell of burned oil, plastic, synthetic leather, meat, grass, wood, and metal stabbed everyone's lungs. They watched the black smoke rising from the just-cooled ashes, then turned away. It was time to fight properly. Even though the command personnel were still incapacitated from shock and toxic smoke, the enemies were already before them, and if they retreated now, they couldn't continue the fight. To prevent disintegration even now, the only option was for the entire army to advance and crush the enemy with numerical superiority. They took a step to cross the ashes and advance, and twitch. Arg! What's wrong?
No.
Jay, just now. Something twitched under my foot. A soldier stepped back after feeling something move beneath the ground. Clearly, something was felt. It wasn't just an insect squirming. It felt like walking on someone's rising and falling chest, someone who was catching their breath. But those who thought he was making a fuss over a mere snake or insect scolded him for wasting time and took a step forward themselves. Twitch, and they too stepped back. Even though their comrades were dying right in front of them, strangely, they couldn't move forward. Beneath their feet, they felt some enormous vibration. It was as if the ground they stepped on was part of a giant egg. Felt like a massive life was sprouting inside. As they instinctively turned their heads at the spine-chilling sensation, they saw smoke still rising from the ash heap. But something was strange. The smoke wasn't dispersing into the sky. It was gathering somewhere. The wind was blowing those smoke and ash particles, gathering them somewhere. Dust from beneath the ground they stood on also rose and joined the smoke formation. Even debris too large to be blown by wind floated up lightly like leaves. They gathered at about chest height, and the black smoke puffed up and contracted rhythmically. The shape looked almost like lungs. Someone muttered in a daze. It was breathing. Something was breathing life into it. And there was light. Equals. The battle continued. As the Spanish tried to hold their collapsing formation, and the Florida forces compensated for their insufficient numbers with powerful firepower, the fight showed no sign of ending. Even as dusk fell and everyone could barely distinguish each other by moonlight and starlight, they continued shooting and screaming. This night the moon was new, and clouds covered the sky, leaving only darkness. What's going on? Why are they suddenly turning around without shooting? And then, whoosh! Suddenly, a bright light shone through the Spanish lines. At the same time, the gunfire decreased, and the Spanish urgently murmured among themselves before retreating toward the recent fire site. Even while shooting at them, the Florida forces cautiously followed, wondering what was happening. What was that light just now? I don't know. Are they firing cannons again? For heaven's sake, don't say such unlucky things. Bang! Bang bang! By now, only the Florida forces were still shooting. The Spanish were either kneeling and trembling, crying, throwing away their guns, or running in all directions. The Florida forces finally reached the center of the Spanish formation, past the surrendering or quietly fleeing Spanish. The center of the explosion where the nameless one had rushed. There they saw it. They saw exactly what the Spanish had seen. Unable to move any further, they stopped in their tracks. realizing that the Spanish were frozen by the same overwhelming feeling. They felt it in the wind. It was night and they were near the coast. This was the time when the land breeze should be blowing methodically from land to sea. But such knowledge couldn't explain the strange whirlwind occurring above those ashes. The figure above the ashes. Each strand of wind was pulling up ash from the soil and adding new colors to the figure, as if painting over it. Blackened things were breaking apart and reassembling, starting to take on new colors. Something was being molded above the ashes, and everyone could tell what it was. It's a person. The shape of a person rose like a heat haze, gradually becoming denser and clearer. From the chest and head to the abdomen and shoulders, then to the upper arms and thighs. Slowly, it was being molded from earth. Finally, down to the fingers and toes. The form of an adult man appeared before them all. That naked body floating lightly in the air like the wind was lifeless like a doll. From the dust, steam rose and gathered into streams of water. As it mixed with the ash, it began to take on a red hue. Blood. It began to seep into the body molded from earth. As it seeped through the nose and mouth of that body, color rose in the glowing body. And the body gently descended to the ground. The body opened its glowing eyes. When Kin Issei looked around, everyone on the ground was kneeling. No one dared to stand on 2 feet. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Genesis 2 verse 7. Chapter 254. Miracle at the Ashes 1.
Alonso
couldn't bring himself to look up. He couldn't even dare to describe what he had just witnessed. He could hear the groans of the Spanish soldiers who closed their eyes, finding it painful even to look at him. Conversely, he could also hear the exclamations of the Florida soldiers who, forgetting their injuries, stared with wide eyes. Amid these contrasting emotions of frustration and joy, despair and hope, Alonso forced himself to open his eyes. There stood a naked man. He was as clean as a newborn child. He was pure, as if never touched by the dust of this world. This man stood barefoot on the ashes, looking down at his own hands, with eyes filled with pure amazement, like seeing something for the first time. Each of his movements was a marvel unfolding before their eyes. Alonso found himself kneeling without realizing it. It felt as if the entire sky was pressing down on him. How could anyone dare to stand on 2 feet in this place? How could anyone commit such disrespect in this place? The high celestial atmosphere pressed down on his body, forcing him to kneel. In this state, Alonso, like others, looked up at him. He briefly looked around with curiosity, then slowly descended from the ashes. His body shimmered in the moonlight like pure silver in mud. It stood in stark contrast to the dismal debris around him. His naked form didn't appear shameful or embarrassing but seemed to show what Adam in the Garden of Eden might have looked like. He truly did not seem to belong to this earth. Then he stepped down from the ashes onto the soil and dead grass. Is it over? That single sentence, heard in various human languages, made Alonso tremble. But the trembling Alonso felt was nothing. Several Spanish soldiers collapsed, foaming at the mouth from the voice resonating in their heads. Some trembled, then got up and fled into the darkness of the night. And still, he seemed unconcerned with the commotion around him. As if he had nothing to do with such trivial and insignificant things, he looked up at the sky with clear, pure eyes. His voice echoed again. Is the fight over? A heavy, emotionless voice stretched out like a spear toward everyone gathered here. The Spanish trembled in fear as if stabbed by a spearhead whenever the voice reached them. Some wailed and bowed their heads at those words. Some lost their minds and babbled nonsense. Some fled. Some, ugh, simply cowered on the ground in fear. He walked toward that cowering Spanish soldier. The one who rose from the ashes, the nameless one, the true messenger of the Lord, approached, and lifting the Spanish soldier's chin, raised the war cry, "You nations, but you will be shattered." Isaiah 8 verse 13. He spoke in a whisper yet clearly, so everyone could hear. Yes, a fragment from the book of Isaiah. A fragment of prophecy the Lord conveyed to Isaiah. A warning to the Assyrians who invaded the land of Judah. Those who do not fear the Lord and do not revere him will ultimately be defeated if they try to attack the land the Lord protects. The soldier, meeting the eyes of the Lord's messenger, trembled in fear and could do nothing. To him, the Nameless One whispered with a smile, with an astonishingly bright smile, "It's not too late yet." And all the remaining Spanish soldiers threw down their weapons. Alonso looked at him. He turned his head and looked at Alonso. He smiled. Seeing that smile, Alonso felt his entire body relax with relief as he sat down. It was over. He was the end of this war. The Spanish army defeated at San Agustin met various fates. Ugh! Ugh!
Monster.
Devil! Some scattered in all directions, trembling in fear. They were soon spotted and captured by freed civilians living nearby, or they returned to San Agustin to surrender on their own. Otherwise, they turned to theft in the vicinity. Commander! The ships! If we can just board the ships, we'll survive. Everyone maintain formation. We must prevent those ships from falling into enemy hands somehow. Another group retreated while maintaining some composure. These remained Spanish soldiers until the end. They carried fallen or injured officers and barely reached the coast, escaping on docked ships. Unfortunately, the Florida forces also suffered severe casualties and couldn't pursue them all. They only managed to capture a few warships left behind. These ships and expensive cannons were valuable additions to the Virginia community, which already severely lacked such items. Vicente, who returned after late reorganization, was delighted. And the third group, I still don't know what I saw that day. But one thing is certain, that's why I surrendered. The Lord was not on our side at that time. Those who surrendered on the spot. They lost all will to resist after witnessing Kin Issei's miracle and chose to surrender. About 1,000 to 2,000 became Florida's prisoners this way. Some of them died, some returned to their homeland, and some remained bound to Florida, but in a way all their fates were the same. In that their lives were forever changed after that day's miracle. Of course, the miracle wasn't everything. If Kin Issei had performed a show of cutting off his arm and reattaching it before the battle, would they have given up fighting? No. They would have charged forward in fury, claiming that the beast of Revelation, the Antichrist, was with the enemy. Conversely, if Kin Issei had simply slaughtered enemies with his excavator without any miracle, would they have retreated? Again, no. They were too elite and well-trained to be disbanded by the appearance of such a strange mechanical device alone. Kin Issei struck fear into them with his excavator. Then Kin Issei used it to completely obliterate their secret weapon, the siege cannon. Finally, Kin Issei was resurrected before their eyes through an inexplicable miracle, which broke them. They had no choice but to be defeated. Around 1,000 Spaniards who chose to remain soldiers until the end crossed the Atlantic in fear. As mentioned earlier, not all Spanish stragglers safely returned to their homeland or surrendered to the Florida forces. Those who belonged to neither group numbered at least 1,000. And these more than 1,000 scattered and fled, avoiding the eyes of the Florida forces. Naturally, the fate of such deserters who fled aimlessly is similar across history and geography. They had to move secretly to avoid the enemy army's eyes. They stuck together as foreigners in a strange land, and they were even armed. Hey, just put down everything you have and leave, and I'll spare your lives. Damn it. Bandits. Bandits. They possessed all the right characteristics to become bandits. The Spaniards couldn't even choose to blend into crowds. No matter how vast Florida might be, it wasn't an empty land but one where natives had originally lived. And the lands ceded to the Spanish government by the natives now belonged to liberated Africans. The only Europeans living in Florida were supporters from Virginia and the few collaborators in San Agustin. Since they stood out too easily by appearance alone, they had no choice but to choose swamps or mountains where people rarely came as their dwelling places, and maintain their livelihood by raiding the surroundings. How's today's harvest? 3 potatoes. You? 5 corn. Mierda, even if we collect it all and make a stew, it's still not enough for a dozen men to share. But easier said than done. African farmers who had just been liberated from slavery couldn't possibly be wealthy. Whatever they stole was just meager vegetables or poor grains. Chapter 255. Miracle at the Ashes. 2. Robbing the northern ranchers was somewhat lucrative, but that was also coming to an end as Florida people supplied guns and weapons to the shepherds. Eventually, they had no choice but to rob farmers who weren't particularly well off. Yet, with heightened vigilance against Europeans after the rebellion, they were inevitably forced to barely survive through banditry or petty theft. And maybe we should surrender even now. Are you crazy? Even if we're caught now, we're not prisoners of war but just bandits. Keep your mouth shut unless you want to get your limbs cut off or be hanged. Besides, do you want to surrender after seeing that scene? That scene. The scene where a human form rose from the ashes, that miracle, that mystery. Ah, if you surrender after seeing the devil's play, it's straight to hell. Understand. They decided among themselves to treat the Indian who came back to life from the ashes as some kind of devil. They all knew well that might not be the answer, but if they acknowledged that fact, wouldn't it mean they had come all this way to act against the Lord's will? Even though they had fallen to become bandits, they couldn't admit that to themselves. If they did, they might truly go mad. Now we have no choice but to live like this for the rest of our lives. So stop talking nonsense. Sergio, who had somehow transformed from a proper Spanish soldier to something like the leader of this bandit group, spat on the ground with words that were half-threatening to his fellow bandits. He didn't want to continue living like this either, but he was afraid. If he surrendered now, regardless of others, he would definitely be hanged for the numerous acts he had committed as a bandit. He didn't want to die at such a young age. Someday, I'll steal a ship and cross the Atlantic. Or if I can just escape to Hispaniola or Cuba. Such unrealistic hope was what drove him in this desperate situation. In fact, most of his companions were probably in a similar situation. Today, too, Sergio and his companions hid in the bushes near some unnamed village path, with guns, which were just for intimidation as they had run out of gunpowder and swords drawn. Take there. I sense someone approaching. Everyone hide and wait. As soon as they come close, we ambush them. Now if only someone would pass by, they would rob them. Cuckoo. Cuckoo. It's the Night Brigade. Talk about bad luck. Why did they have to pass by? They remained as silent as mice, waiting for that massive, vicious war tractor to pass. Cuckoo. Thud. Ha! What? Why did it stop? Sir Skinner, why did you suddenly stop? Yes, we still have a long way to go. The English youth who seemed to be a squire and an Indian wearing the insignia of a Night Brigade technician shouted at the knight who suddenly released the lever. Then the knight looked up at the sky and said, "Shoo, I smell something." "What smell, sir?" "Perhaps." "He's going to talk nonsense again. Just keep quiet." "It's not nonsense." The man called Sir Skinner suddenly glared with wide eyes near the bushes where Sergio was hiding and said, "I smell those who know no honor from here. Those rat bastards always hide in places like this." "What? How did he know?" "Stop talking nonsense and just get down." Thud. Sir Skinner, jumping down from the tractor control seat with all sorts of heavy equipment, walked straight toward Sergio, drew his sword and slash. He cut widely right next to where Sergio was hiding. Sergio felt his trouser leg getting wet as he covered his own mouth. "Nothing there." "Probably not. Let's just go." "Why are you so crooked?" "Well, because last time you tied a horse to the front of the tractor saying a knight needs a horse. That's why." "What's wrong with that?" "The horse became horse mincemeat, and my assistant and I had to spend 6 hours cleaning up the blood. Anyway, let's go. There seems to be nothing here." "Well, fine. Must have been my imagination." At the technician's words, Sir Skinner grumbled as he climbed back onto the tractor. And the war tractor continued on its way. Or so you thought. Just as Sergio thought that, the tractor made a sharp turn and instantly crushed the bushes where Sergio was hiding. As Sergio trembled and crawled backward, all his companions nearby jumped out and began running in all directions. Look at these bandits who know no honor and fled from the battlefield. Like garbage. Hoo. PP, please spare my life. Hand over everything you have right now. Guns, armor, everything. It seemed contradictory that he had just been talking about a band of thieves. But, are you perhaps equating the legitimate spoils a knight obtains in fair combat with stolen goods from thievery? Growling. To dare equate an honorable knight with a thief. Anyway, that's what happened. Equals. That's the story. After that, as an honorable knight, I received permission from Commander Oitoten and tied up the bandit leader Sergio and his evil companions. I paraded them through nearby villages, then imprisoned them in the underground jail of San Agustin. Well done. Ha. What are you saying? It's only natural as a knight. And that breastplate? I received it from the bandits as payment for their rehabilitation. It's something I obtained through fair fighting as a knight. What is this? When I looked at Oitoten, he subtly avoided my gaze. After giving Sir Skinner appropriate greetings, I turned to look aside. I too have captured evil bandits and come to present their plunder to the Nameless One. I have come to report my achievement of slaying the monster bull that has been troubling farmers recently. Why? How did the Agricultural Knight Brigade turn into a collection of knight-obsessed Don Quixote wannabes? The heyday of knights ended hundreds of years ago. Didn't it? I don't know. It's all because my subordinates have been wrongly influenced. Oitoten, you bastard, look how quickly you dodge when it suits you. When I glared at him, he avoided my eyes while sweating profusely. When I moved to the direction, he turned his eyes and glared again. He closed his eyes completely. So I said, "It seems you're hiding something from me, Sir Oitoten. How could that be? I always pursue only truth and justice day and night for the prosperity of Nemo and the community." I wasn't trying to hide it. I just omitted one small fact and didn't mention it. Woo-woo. Sir Henry of Chesapeake has defeated Sir Comas. Wah. What unfolded before me was a kind of track, with a partition in the middle. Two tractors charged toward each other with that partition between them. Boom. Wah. Sir Henry is on a winning streak. Amazing. Henry's technician Enrique is showing incredible skill. They thrust lances at each other's tractor armor. Surprisingly, it's safe. With the track and partition, there's no worry of collision, and the driver's seats are safely protected by Lexan and steel. The problem is, why are you doing this? Why are they having a jousting tournament with tractors? And when did they install such an arena in Florida? Why didn't I know about this until now? Ahem. Through this competition, knights and technicians are prevented from neglecting the honing of their skills. It's fun, isn't it? Please just be honest. Really, don't you find it fun? Those huge hunks of metal maintaining distance so as not to collide, then charging at full speed to thrust lances at each other. If you truly swear to the Lord that you, Nemo, don't find it fun, I will order my knights to abolish this. It is fun. I believed you would say so without a doubt. Jousting with steam-powered tanks? Anyone who wouldn't find this fun must have something wrong with them. But even so, I wonder what's the point of this. I want to become a knight too. Please accept me as a squire. Me too. I'll do anything if you'll accept me. Please send me to Virginia. Long live the Virginia community. Long live the Nameless One. There's the point. After the competition, I counted the number of applications to join the Knight Brigade that flooded Oitoten. It seemed there would be no shortage of personnel in the Knight Brigade for a while. What is this? Really, what is all this? Chapter 256. Discipline 1. Seville and Lisbon, and Madrid and Valladolid too. In every city where the Spanish king's influence reached, strange rumors were circulating. In the west, across the vast Atlantic, a monster lives. He does not know death. He possesses an immortal body. He is a devil, the Antichrist. This is the true identity of the Indian emperor who was said to have allied with the Queen of England. Those so-called saints of London they boasted about are also products of this devil. No, he is actually a holy angel. It was he who interfered with the slave trade of the once great empire in the name of saving slaves, joining forces with English pirates. He is the Indian emperor, and he possesses a body that knows no death. Like this, various rumors about one subject spread and mixed, becoming jumbled. Sometimes contradictory, sometimes conflicting stories became intertwined. Many people took interest in these strange rumors. It wasn't just ignorant people and those who enjoyed exaggerating stories. Tell me again, Commander. My interests are the king's interests. We want to hear. Gradually, from high places the interest began to spread. The Duke of Lerma carefully extended his intelligence network to find the port cities that were the sources of the rumors. And he identified those who had initially spread them. The result was this meeting. Tell me again. What did you see there? At those words, Juan de Aguila y Arellano gave a hollow laugh and shook his head. When the Duke of Lerma frowned at this attitude, he said, I'm about to be dismissed anyway, so why do you still call me Commander, Duke? All this talk about your will being the king's will, just cheap threats. What? I already know that you're blaming the failure of the Florida expedition entirely on my incompetence. I, who has worked so hard for my country. Juan de Aguila spoke, grinding his teeth. In Malta, in Corsica, in Flanders, in Brittany, in Ireland. I have fought for my country in all those places. I have achieved numerous military accomplishments, and I have served my country. I too am well aware of your dedication. The king and I. Silence. I am not a fool. Calm yourself. Calm? Fine. You asked me to speak again? I'll tell you as much as you want. He pointed at the Duke of Lerma's face and said, There is a mysterious being there. Whether an angel, a devil, or something else, it may not be my concern. But remember this. If that being had not been there, I would have successfully suppressed the Florida rebellion. The recent failure is not due to my incompetence but because of that being, because of the fate that the Lord has created. Having said this, Juan de Aguila strode out of the Duke of Lerma's room. The Duke sighed deeply and sat down in a nearby armchair to rest. He considered many thoughts. A being that resurrects from death. The truth of the rumor was easily cross-verified through the mouths of many people. So the conclusion was ultimately one of two possibilities. Mass hallucination and madness, or it's real. Either way, the possibility was equally chilling. Should he announce this immediately and use it for propaganda? That the true identity of the Indian emperor, who had been so close with England, was actually a devil? Perhaps he should. No. If Felipe III had been interested in state affairs, he might have done so. But the Duke of Lerma had no such intention. He must not increase the church's influence. He could clearly see how various clerical families would become emboldened at court, what words they would whisper into the king's ear. He had no intention of allowing them to erode his power and threaten his position. That wasn't all. At the very least, if they had achieved some results in battle, it might be different. But they were utterly defeated. By slaves who had just picked up guns and swords, veterans who had served throughout Europe were defeated. Moreover, their forces had enjoyed numerical superiority several times over. What could he announce and use as propaganda in such a situation? That a miracle occurred and the enemy achieved an overwhelming victory against their forces? If mishandled, there could be a severe backlash. In an already precarious situation, if distrust in the government led by the Duke of Lerma increased, it would be over. From the nation's perspective, it was a double-edged sword. And from the Duke of Lerma's personal perspective, If it was poison, it must be buried. Having made this judgment, the Duke of Lerma slowly reported to the king. Your Majesty, the reason for our failure to suppress the rebellion in Florida is clear. Is that so? Yes. Virginia supported the slaves. They preemptively attacked us who were managing the colony, so we are already at war. He changed the perspective. The recent battle was not simply about suppressing a slave rebellion but part of a full-scale war with Virginia. Defeat was a possibility that could be sufficiently considered. Therefore, the rumors circulating now are not important. The war would continue. For now, they had only lost one battle. The war with Spain itself was still not over. From Spain's perspective, the battle in Florida would have been seen as an extension of the war with England and Virginia. After all, wasn't the reason for establishing Florida to check us, and weren't we the ones who supported the Florida people? So even though we immediately repelled Spain from Florida, the war with Spain won't end in the future. It's just that the Viceroyalty of New Spain, having exhausted its military capabilities, and Spain proper, having been badly burned in the New World, won't directly target this place for the time being. However, the immediate practical fighting was over. It was our community's first victory in battle. Against Europe's strongest country, no less. I feel boundless emotion. Anyway, there's no longer a need for materials to arm thousands with guns and various equipment, and to feed, shelter, and clothe thousands. It's time to send them back. You've decided to continue sending them? Is that the will of the Sixth Council? Yes, Nameless One. The Apostles have decided so. It seems they're offloading excess supplies to Liberia in Africa as well. I see. Yes, that's possible. After all, we did have an overflow of military supplies. We can push out the remaining inventory. It will take time to offload such supplies for the time being. But here are the documents sent from the Council of Six. Please take a look. That's quite a lot of paper. Yes, there's been more lately. A factory was set up recently. It's one-sided paper. I frowned like a small business owner furious about not reusing paper, then relaxed my face. Until recently, paper and everything else was all imported, so the absolute quantity was insufficient. So we usually used the back of used paper? I responded with something like, still, we should use the back of the paper for most things. Tisk. No matter how common paper becomes, it's by 17th century standards. We should know how precious resources are. Wait, why am I acting this way? Why am I behaving like a middle-aged man in his 40s? I'm in my vibrant 20s. No, I'm not. I'm in my late 40s. In this moment of realization, I trembled. No, that can't be right. I'm in my 20s, my body is in its 20s. Am I soon going to start craving StarCraft and Sakala candy? Of course, with my body like this, I won't be able to eat greasy food later and I won't get middle-aged fat, but is this why I've been finding it annoying to meet people lately? Is this why I sometimes chuckle to myself at terrible dad jokes that suddenly come to mind while walking, then check if people are looking? And why I reminisce about being in Japan, thinking, TSK, there aren't any decent games or movies these days. It's true. Am I also aging? Yes. How old do I look to you? Chapter 257. Discipline 2. Only after asking did I realize. With that question, I had completed it. Like a late teenager? Of course, your actual age must be countless. Asking an employee if I look young for my age. Anyway, this is strange. Your button has fallen off. I can give you one. Thank you, but it's fine. A button factory was built recently, and buttons are in abundance. I'll just attach a new one I bought last time. I see. The attitude of the clerk from the community is somewhat extravagant. Well, our community people have always lived somewhat luxuriously. But this feels different. We always struggled with a shortage of everyday items. Most daily necessities were all imported. And no matter how much money we had, there was a limit to the quantity of daily necessities we could have delivered across the Atlantic. Paper, hairpins, buttons, hair oil, ink, and so on. These things were always in short supply even if we used them sparingly. But somehow, the atmosphere has changed. What is it? Why have we suddenly become so abundant? Rewinding time slightly to several months ago. Virginia's Assembly and the Council of Six received reports of victory throughout Florida. The entire community celebrated with food and drink, and people in the streets held hands, danced, or sang together. As such a grand festival took place after a long time, monasteries and factories temporarily closed. Now, we don't need more military supplies. I suppose not. Should we reduce the order volume significantly? How much would be appropriate? About 1/10 of the current amount should be sufficient, Mrs. Dare. Soon they would close permanently. Arg! My factory, the shoe and uniform factory of the Welsh carpenter Taran, which had been earning tidy profits, was also in the same situation. Perhaps it was an overreach to build a factory that produced thousands of pairs of shoes in a town of 100,000 people. Like that, factories that had profited from the community's frenzied purchasing of supplies for Florida and the Night Brigade were all facing closure. Moreover, the 15,000 monastics from the community and 170 monasteries who cried out, "Where do we work now?" also fell into a panic. There's nowhere to sell products. Where can we distribute this excess supply? There's nowhere to work. Nowhere to accumulate honor while dedicating ourselves to the community. Of course, places producing materials still necessary for the community survived. The tractor factory that Kin Issei and various craftsmen had painstakingly established remained intact. Tractors were essential for farming, and several had been damaged in this battle. Similarly, factories producing various parts needed for manufacturing and repairing tractors also operated smoothly. You want to join the tractor monastery?
Yes.
Let me first give you safety guidelines and equipment. After 3 months of education and probation, if you don't meet our expected standards, you cannot become an official monastic. I understand. The monasteries attached to such places saw their honor shine even brighter. Places that steadily served the community without being shaken by the flow of the war or individual events. Moreover, their members needed both the brains to memorize complex processes and the dexterity to maintain fast, precise work. Before long, the monasteries in these major fields increasingly screened entrants through more demanding skill assessments and strict discipline, and thoroughly educated their monastics. As respect and admiration for these monasteries and monastics also increased, it became easier to provide the honor and status people desired. So, several monasteries transformed into institutions for training and educating skilled workers. However, the rest of the factories and monasteries were different. Many factories simply closed, and the members of the monasteries attached to them scattered to find other similar work. The surviving factory owners likewise scrambled to produce honorable labor that could contribute to the community, and they soon found an escape route. Buttons. What? Taran, what do you mean? Buttons and pins fall off frequently, so people keep buying them. What if we stop making clothes and just make and sell buttons and pins? And instead of military scarves, we could make handkerchiefs that will be used briefly and discarded. Everyday consumables. Items that can be used in large quantities if needed, and whose demand rarely ceases. Serve the community's officials. Make paper for community documents yourself. Make handkerchiefs for the cleanliness of the community. Those who changed fields this way tried their best to attract simple laborers. Promotional flyers were plastered on bulletin boards in village squares, and naturally, a factory for printing flyers was also established. As factories disappeared and reappeared, the monasteries situated beside them couldn't help but change as well. It seems difficult for us to continue living together now. Couldn't be helped. As existing factories failed, their subordinate monastics scattered to various factories for different ascetic practices. But let's continue to hold occasional gatherings of our monastery, and since we're still working in similar fields, let's maintain our previous disciplines. Let's do that, for the honor of our monastery. But the monasteries didn't disappear. The honor attributed to ascetic practices varied depending on which monastery one belonged to and what work one did. Waking up at set times, keeping the body clean every morning, observing prayer times. Even while everyone lived in their own homes, they created more flexible and relaxed disciplines to maintain a regular lifestyle like they would in a monastery. Groups that demanded their members be more diligent and sincere, to hone themselves to be solid and devout within a more regular lifestyle. Some monasteries valued regular life and the strictness of work, so they contracted with factories requiring more precise dexterity and collective action to supply monastics. Some monasteries sent monastics to factories needing night shifts, maintaining the discipline that one should not shy away from work others avoid. Thus, factories received labor suited to their needs through monasteries. Now, industrial monasteries took on the role of nurturing and educating their members to be labor forces more suitable for industry. Hundreds and thousands of laborers were thus invested in various industries. If Qin Yi Sei had seen it, he might have been reminded of vocational training centers or specialized educational institutions. However, amid the transformation of monasteries, there was one farm that hardly changed its appearance.
Rain.
It's raining, brothers and sisters. Move the cotton immediately. It was the cotton farm. The cotton fields that Qin Yi Sei had planted to try to reduce the enormous import of cotton fiber were essentially not being properly managed. Cotton fields are typically located in sparsely populated areas and require immediate labor input based on weather conditions. If cotton gets wet from rain near harvest time, it becomes too damp to pick and must be left to dry entirely. Conversely, if it opens completely and dries, the cotton might fly away in the wind or fall to the ground, so the harvest must be completed quickly beforehand. That's why slaves who could stay near the fields for 24 hours were suitable for cotton cultivation. In other words, people who lived in remote places, stayed attached for 24 hours, lived communally, and lived with hard labor. Yes, monastics also meet all these conditions. Therefore, while many monasteries were being corrupted, cotton cultivation monasteries maintained a form relatively close to the original monastery model. Due to this rarity, conversely, membership applications surged. Of course, most of these people had never properly grown cotton, let alone gotten their hands dirty. These monastics needed someone to supervise and guide them. Please, Teacher Pedro, if you insist so much. So, mainly former slaves with cotton growing experience entered as supervisors for these monasteries. Even so, why choose such hard labor? Well, they say it's more honorable. I can't understand it. English people are indeed strange. And so they quietly circled around the cotton fields, passing on cotton-picking methods to the English. Chapter 258. Government ruled. 1. Florida has virtually no government. No, it would be more accurate to say that there's hardly any formal governance structure or administrative apparatus at all. The vacuum of power is palpable across the war-torn region. At most, there exists a largely symbolic assembly that calls itself a government, a pale shadow of legitimate authority, alongside the clandestine underground organization carefully cultivated and embedded by the enigmatic Nemo over many years. If one were compelled to identify a single entity that could legitimately claim to represent the collective interests and will of all Florida's remaining inhabitants, it would undoubtedly be the hastily assembled council. This unlikely coalition brings together the charismatic leaders of the slave uprising, pragmatic Spanish collaborators who had switched allegiances when the tide turned, and the battle-hardened operatives from Nemo's underground network who had emerged from the shadows. And after a surprisingly brief but intensely focused meeting, lasting barely long enough for the sun to move perceptibly across the sky, they reached their momentous decision with remarkable clarity and unity of purpose. Alonso Garcia, who became the representative of this meeting according to rotation, said, "Everyone gathered here, including myself, seems to agree." At these solemn words, all those present, faces etched with the hardships of recent years but eyes now bright with conviction, nodded in silent affirmation and deliberately raised their hands in the ancient gesture of consensus. It was unanimous. Thus, they decided to join Virginia. In truth, this decision wasn't made during the 37-minute meeting that had just taken place. The decision had been made at the final moment of the recent battle, when his body was burned and then resurrected from soil and ashes. At that moment, everyone present knelt before him. So the vote had essentially already taken place. Again, unanimously. Thus, Florida's fate was decided, and time passed quickly. Florida is a colony established purely for strategic purposes, Caribbean defense, and keeping Virginia in check. Economic profit was only a secondary consideration. The half-abandoned Spanish slave owners made money by growing various cash crops like fruits or cotton using slave labor supported by the viceroyalty, or by raising cattle and horses. The role of Spanish merchants was to exchange these cash crops and livestock for money and various necessities. And after the rebellion, Spanish merchants stopped coming. The liberated African slaves were left all alone here. For now, they could only maintain the fields their masters had operated, barely cultivating their own small gardens or obtaining food through exchanges with the natives. And then war broke out on top of that. It's an environment that couldn't help but be impoverished. Although the fighting here had mostly concluded, the people of Florida were still hungry. They needed someone's help. Moreover, didn't they express hope for integration into the community? Thus, Manteo came to Florida according to the decision of the Council of Six. Until just now, there had been no problems. The voyage was safe and peaceful, the supplies brought were safely delivered, and all the sailors and companions were reliable. Even after arriving at San Agustin, there were no particular issues. Whether soldiers or government leaders, everyone welcomed him, and naturally, the civilians who came for aid even regarded him as a savior. And then, Manteo now sensed with his keen perception that he was screwed. Ah! Ha ha ha! Why are you asking about the Indians in this area? No reason. Do you know about the Apalachee tribe? Of course I do, but that's fine then. Somehow during the conversation, the topic of the local Americans in Florida came up. It seemed they were about to mention what role they played in this revolution. At that moment, the atmosphere briefly became awkward. Manteo quickly scanned the American clerks who had come with him. Beneath their skilled expressionlessness, he sensed some emotion. And that emotion was injecting a faint anxiety throughout this space. When else had he felt this kind of anxiety? Ah, right. He had felt this many times before. Because, Manteo, my friend, I don't know much about native affairs. Could I ask you to handle this? Mr. Manteo, if you don't mind, could you tell us how to resolve conflicts between tribes? Manteo, I need a favor. There seems to be some misunderstanding due to language differences between those tribes. Everyone dumped these similar tasks on him, as the only American among the 6 apostles. Somehow, recalling these memories left a bitter taste in his mouth, though he couldn't explain why. If he had experienced the future racial discrimination of being greeted with konnichiwa because he was Asian, and then being forced to multitask both Vietnamese and Arabic market analysis in the Asian department, the story might have been different. But unfortunately, he lacked such future knowledge. Manteo felt bad without knowing why he felt bad. Anyway, his sense developed from such multitasking was ringing. He remembered when immigrants flooded in from the south and tribal conflicts were severe, when Nemo rushed into a burning hut to save the great chief of the Tutelo tribe. After Nemo gave an excellent speech, he was the one stuck with the cleanup and mediating tribal conflicts. Anyway, that awkward atmosphere he often felt then. This is precursor to conflict. As expected. This is Nemo, what do you think? Judging this wasn't something he could resolve on his own, Manteo immediately went to Nemo to report. It seems there's significant resentment among the various tribal people who joined our community toward the American tribes in this area. Many of them joined our community far north because they were driven out by those who allied with Spain, right? From what I see, it seems Florida will soon join our community. So what should we do? It was a reasonably succinct explanation of the situation. As Manteo was feeling proud of his logical explanation, Nemo's expression became slightly ambiguous. Manteo sensed an ominous feeling again. And Nemo, as he usually did when pondering, stroked his chin with his right hand. We need to approach this problem slowly and carefully. As expected, out came Nemo's usual phrase for situations where, I don't want to decide right now, it doesn't seem urgent, but I can't say nothing. Chapter 259. Government ruled. 2. Carefully. Yes, please investigate this matter. I'm counting on you, Manteo. Understood. Manteo bowed his head deeply and had to leave without accomplishing anything. And Mr. Manteo, right now outside. And, as if on cue, a problem immediately erupts. So, what happened? When Nemo asked, Oitoten answered, well, that knight friend is from the Muskogee tribe. He's originally from a village slightly north of Florida. I see. While walking, he encountered someone. That's this friend. Oitoten pointed at two men with his finger as he spoke. And the Muskogee knight apparently asked this friend in Spanish where he lived and how he came here, just out of boredom. So, please get to the conclusion. That knight friend tried to kill this friend. Please explain the process again as well. According to Oitoten's explanation, the situation was as follows. Muskogee Knight A met American B who lived in this area and started talking to him, during which he learned B's tribal origin, the Apalachee tribe, a tribe that was Spain's ally and that drove the Muskogee from their land while serving as mercenaries at Spain's request. Upon hearing this, said to B, he requested a trial by combat in the name of knightly honor and the Lord. What? Yes. What? Yes. A European-style trial by combat requested by a Native American to another Native American. After imagining that scene, Manteo and Nemo shook their heads vigorously to clear the bizarre image, then returned their attention to Oitoten's story. Anyway, I stopped that friend. Well done. That knight obsession. I told him it makes no sense to challenge someone who isn't armed and isn't a knight to a duel on knightly honor. Manteo sighed as he saw Nemo's expression hardening unpleasantly. Nemo, it seems the conflict I mentioned has finally surfaced. What should we do about this? When Manteo asked, Nemo's pupils began to rotate fiercely. He blinked several times, glared at the idiot who requested the duel or whatever, and, for issues like this, we need to seek advice from an expert, said with a sigh. Let's go to Raleigh. That's the situation. What should we do? For a moment, a strange thought flashed through Raleigh's mind after hearing the circumstances from Nemo. Divide and rule. If one side disappears, there's no conflict. He wasn't sure why such thoughts suddenly came to mind. It was as if the voice of a colonialist and imperialist flowing in his blood had spoken that way. Anyway, Raleigh quickly shook his head to clear the sudden intrusive thoughts and answered, That's troublesome. Yes, very troublesome indeed. Nemo replied with a sigh to Raleigh's words. First, when I spoke with various people forming the government-like entity in Florida, most people wanted to join us. To Raleigh, that was obvious. The possibility of Florida surviving alone against the mighty fleet and military power of the Spanish Empire was virtually non-existent. Even without such practical reasons, if they had witnessed a miracle, how could they not be absorbed into Nemo's sphere of influence? Thinking this, Raleigh nodded, and Nemo continued. But if they join us and form a government with us, what should we do going forward? It won't be easy to reconcile conflicts like back then. That's true. The reason we were able to mediate and resolve conflicts between the Catawba tribe, the Tutelo tribe, and other tribes was partly because Nemo calmed them by burning his own body, but the fact that they were all tired from hunger and had entrusted themselves to the community also played a major role. But what about the natives of Florida? They don't particularly want anything from us. No, they're not even interested in our existence. We're talking about incorporating such people into our community. That's right. And that's the crucial point. Moreover, the largest population group in Florida is precisely those natives. Not the liberated African slaves or Spaniards who formed the government and decided to join the community. Raleigh pointed to the North American map before him and circled the areas near Virginia and Florida. When two separate groups of similar weight become one, there are several methods of governance. First, we incorporate them into our government. then how many representatives would emerge from their tribes? And without a moment of reconciliation like before, conflicts will inevitably arise. Perhaps that conflict could paralyze and destroy the government. So the first option won't work. Is there a second option? Of course, Mantio. The second is to dispatch a governor. Dispatching a governor, just as England does to Ireland. In this case, there's less room for conflict within the same government, which is convenient. But there are still drawbacks. I think I understand. Those unilaterally ruled through a governor would resist.
No.
That's a relatively minor issue. Nemo, who immediately thought of the Japanese governor-general upon hearing the word governor, tilted his head. Raleigh continued his explanation. What if either the governor or one of the various figures constituting the government accompanying the governor harbors resentment toward the natives of the Florida region? What if he beats one of them to death? We couldn't assume such incidents wouldn't happen. We had just barely prevented something similar from occurring. It would be over. Virginia and Florida would become eternal enemies. Is there a third option? Yes, of course there is. It's the most stable but trickiest method. Let them establish a separate government. Let them handle their internal affairs themselves, and we just help. Then, however, we shouldn't let them form a government like ours. Why not? Well, because we are too democratic. At Raleigh's words, Nemo tilted his head, not understanding. Raleigh continued his explanation. Think about it. The majority of their population consists of natives who were Spain's allies. Wouldn't it be difficult for our government to maintain friendly relations with a government dominated by them? Who knows? Perhaps war could break out again. So, as we move toward a federal system, it might not be bad to try forming this type of government in Florida. What kind of government do you mean? To Nemo's question, Raleigh smiled, leaned forward, and said, a government ruled by trustworthy people. For example, that priest, or that bishop. Chapter 260, Government Ruled, 3. I broke into a cold sweat after hearing Raleigh's words. No, so right now, you're saying we should establish people who suit our taste as heads of government. Yes. But don't we lack justification for that? On the surface, an independent country, but with government positions filled by people chosen to suit the mother country's taste. We call that a puppet state. As a citizen of a country that experienced both becoming a puppet state and then annexation, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. I cautiously raised the issue with Raleigh. They achieved liberation from Spain through an uprising for freedom. No matter how much they desire to join our community, we can't just do as we please with such people. There would be strong resistance. That depends on the justification. Indeed, is it because he's British? His way of thinking is slightly different from mine. And don't worry, if you're concerned that we might treat them like a vassal state, that we might ignore their sovereignty as we please, that won't happen. Really? I'm not sure why you harbor such doubts, but no, that will never happen. Aren't they our brothers and sisters? Then please explain. The United Kingdom, I know, consists of England with its fiery hooligans, Scotland with its clear water and flowing whiskey, Northern Ireland with its abundant soil potatoes, and Wales with its air-like lack of presence. These four. Thus, when these four regions controlling the four elements of fire, water, earth, and air come together, it's like summoning Exodia. The great demon king of world history appears. That's what I understand. And didn't the Union of Crowns between Scotland and England form recently? That's right. The current Raleigh is the father of imperialism who left terrifying quotes like, "For whosoever commands the sea commands the trade. Whosoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world, and consequently the world itself." Unbelievable. Let's see what kind of proper proposal he brings. As someone from a post-colonial country, I'm about to fact-bomb the father of colonialism and imperialism. Establish a bishopric. What? Yes. What? That's not a strange proposal. I expected something like an evil underground secret government, or control through brainwashing via a cult religion. Exactly. What is a bishopric? Though I'm not quite sure what it is. I pretended to be an angel ignorant of the murky institutions and knowledge of the human world, for the first time in a while, widening my eyes and tilting my head. This way, people tend to forgive my ignorance. Haha! It's exactly as it sounds. Land ruled by a bishop. As expected, Raleigh began his explanation with a hearty laugh. When a king appoints a bishop as lord over land he rules, that land becomes a bishopric. Isn't it simple? So, it's land where a bishop acts as a feudal lord. Correct. I am a person from the 21st century. Although the proportion of time I've lived in the 16th and 17th centuries is becoming comparable to my time in the 21st, Japan of the 21st century remains my spiritual homeland, my point of reference. And when I, as such a person, look at this from a 21st century perspective, would such a country function properly? Of course. I'm worried. Surely a strange theocratic state won't be established in Florida. A country ruled by religious leaders sounds completely like ISIS. Wait, the Vatican is like that too, isn't it? The Vatican of the 21st century or the Papal States may be a mini-state, but it still functions outwardly as an independent country. And now it's the 17th century, about 400 years before that. Far from being problematic, Raleigh's tone suggests there are abundant examples. Appointing a bishop as a feudal lord, land ruled by a bishop. Moreover, in our unnamed church, whether bishop or priest, they are elected by vote, so it could be considered somewhat democratic. Not bad? Since it sounded quite good initially, I folded my arms and began to listen more attentively to Raleigh's words. Raleigh, seeming to understand my silent signal, continued his explanation. Look, even now, just looking at the Holy Roman Empire, numerous territories are under the rule of prince-bishops, first bishop. I haven't heard any news of something going significantly wrong in such domains. Moreover, don't we have term limits for our bishops? If something goes wrong, wouldn't the priests under them vote for a different bishop in the next election? That's true. And it's just that a bishop is at the top. The government doesn't need to be integrated with the church organization. So you can rest assured. The separation of church and state is maintained to some extent. Florida's sovereignty is respected, and only those who have accepted us as unnamed followers will be ordained as bishops to become Florida's leaders. For now, it's perfect. Seeing my expression completely relaxed, Raleigh appeared relieved and sat down, taking the tension out of his shoulders. Good. Seems like we'll proceed with this. Look, even the Habsburg dynasty ruling the Holy Roman Empire now is mediating conflicts well through these prince-bishops. Isn't it? What did you say? I was saying that the Habsburgs of the Holy Roman Empire are managing religious and ethnic conflicts well through bishoprics. For example, their relationship with the Protestant regions. Managing religious and ethnic conflicts well. When did the 30 Years' War start again? Anyway, a sinister feeling suddenly began to creep up, but I dispelled it with the power of reason. No. The American land is fundamentally different from the Holy Roman Empire, right? Since we have tens of thousands of believers living there, and with the natives included hundreds of thousands, there can't be just one bishop. We need to elect several more. And among them, we need to elect a representative. I guess we can elect an archbishop. Then it would be an archbishopric rather than a bishopric. Good. The process ahead is roughly taking shape in my mind. I nodded and said to Raleigh, then, first we should gather the priests of that region for a formal vote and elect bishops and an archbishop. Yes, and then appoint him as the Lord of the Archbishopric of Florida. After that, the Florida people will handle things themselves. So if we do that... Wait, Raleigh? Yes. Appoint as Lord? In the Holy Roman Empire, who typically invests bishops as lords? I asked a question that seemed too obvious. Why, the Emperor of the Empire, of course. Raleigh answered with an expression suggesting He wondered why I would ask such a thing. Emperor. Right. Then, I'll prepare for the Lord's investiture ceremony. Let's submit a proposal to the Council of Six. I'm playing the role of emperor. Equals. Alonso recalls his conversation with the bishop. I won't stand at the forefront. But bishop, without your organization, so many slaves wouldn't have gained freedom. Besides you, there's no suitable candidate. It's not my organization. At that time, the bishop spoke with a face that somehow seemed both sad and relieved. It's his organization. I came here looking for my wife, and recently, I found where she was buried and laid flowers. That's enough for me. But priests who share my vision will also remain without revealing their identities. A secretive and systematic organization has many uses. That's how we must serve the community. Many Spaniards have joined too. Didn't you endure unnecessary slave life for over a decade? There should be compensation. That position shouldn't be compensation for my life. That position is created by the collective will of Florida's free people. He wanted to protest more, but the will of the bishop, leading the secret society, was clear. It seems our organization members will vote for you, even without me specifically instructing them. Congratulations. You are the first archbishop. What did I do during the uprising to accept it? The bishop, as always, spoke while melting into the darkness, concealing himself, as if that was more familiar to him. The people have chosen you.